Tonight, picture a shallow lake in a wide brown country, far from anywhere you have ever heard of. It is the hottest part of a summer afternoon. The water is low and the color of weak tea, and it is thick with silt, and horses have been standing in it, and nobody would drink it if there were any other water within a day's ride. There is no city on the shore. There are no banners. There is nothing to look at but grass and sky and a low line of hills going soft in the heat. At the edge of that lake there are 19 tired men and one man standing among them, and every one of them is filthy, and none of them owns anything worth stealing. They have lost. That is the plain fact of the afternoon. They have lost their herds and their tents and their families and most of their friends, and what is left of them is standing in the mud of a lake nobody has bothered to name properly. They kneel down. They cup their hands. They drink that brown water, all of them together, and they say a few words to one another that they will remember to the end of their lives. Hold that picture somewhere at the back of your mind, and we will come back to it much later when you are further into the night, because within 20 years, the man at the center of that little group of muddy, ruined men will rule more of the surface of the earth than anyone who has ever lived before him, and the descendants of those 19 will speak of that lake as other people speak of holy places. His name at that moment was Temujin. The world would come to call him Genghis Khan. Before we go on, settle yourself. Let the room be as dark and as quiet as you can make it. Push the pillow into the shape you like. Let your shoulders come down from where they have been sitting all day, one quiet inch at a time. There is nothing in this story that will startle you. There are no sudden noises here, no raised voices, no twists held back to keep you awake. I am going to tell you a whole life, slowly, from the first breath to the last. And if you fall asleep partway through it, then it has done exactly what it was made to do. You can always come back tomorrow and find the parts you missed. If you enjoy what I do here, and only if you truly enjoy it, a like helps quietly, somewhere behind the scenes, and helps other people who cannot sleep find their way to this channel. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. There is something oddly comforting about scrolling that list at 3 a.m. and finding that somebody in a small town on the other side of the world is lying awake at exactly the same moment as you. Now, let us go back much further than the muddy lake, because to understand this life, you first have to understand the country that made it, and that country was already very old and very strange long before anybody in it was called a Khan. Imagine a sea made of grass. It begins somewhere in the low hills west of the great river bends of northern China, and it runs west, and it keeps running west. Through what we now call Mongolia and southern Siberia, across the top of the world's dry middle, over the Altai and the Tian Shan passes, across the flat brown emptiness north of the Caspian, and it does not properly stop until it reaches the plains of Hungary. You could, in theory, put a horse's nose into that grass at one end and walk the animal to the other end without ever leaving it. It is the longest continuous piece of grazing land on earth, and for thousands of years it was the world's largest highway, except that nobody built it and nobody owned it, and nothing on it stayed still. Out in that grass, in the part we are concerned with, the land is high. It sits about a mile above the sea, which means the air is thin and clean and enormously cold in winter. The rain comes in small amounts and mostly in summer. The rivers are shallow and clear and full of round stones. In the north, there are dark forests of larch and pine coming down off the mountains. And in the south, the grass thins and yellows and finally gives up entirely and turns into the gravel and sand of the Gobi. Between those two edges, the forest above and the desert below. There is a belt of open pasture perhaps 600 miles deep, and everything in this story happens on it or because of it. Nothing about this country encourages farming. You can turn the soil, and things will grow, and then in an ordinary year the frost will take them halfway through what ought to be the growing season, or the rain will simply not arrive, and you will starve beside your own tidy fields. So the people who live there did the sensible thing. Instead of asking the land to make food for them directly, they let animals do the converting. Grass into milk, grass into meat, grass into wool and felt and leather and dung for the fire. The whole civilization of the steppe is, in a sense, a machine for turning grass into human beings by way of an animal's stomach. They kept 5 kinds of animal, and the number 5 mattered to them rather as the number of his fields might matter to a farmer elsewhere. Horses first, always, then sheep, then goats, then cattle, and then, at the dry southern edge, camels. Each animal ate a slightly different part of the pasture and gave a slightly different thing back, and a family that had all 5 was a family that could survive a bad year, because whatever the weather did, some part of the herd would come through it. Everything moved with the seasons. In spring, the families went out to the open flats where the new grass came first, and the animals dropped their young, and everyone was suddenly rich in milk. In summer, they went higher, up onto the cool slopes where the flies were fewer and the water still ran. In autumn, they came down again and let the beasts eat themselves fat, because fat was the only bank there was. In winter, they tucked themselves into a valley or the lee of a ridge, out of the worst of the wind, and lived on what the summer had put by. 4 moves a year, more or less, over the same circuit, generation after generation. It was not wandering. It was a route, as fixed and as well understood as a road, and every family knew whose route was whose. They lived inside a round tent of felt stretched over a lattice of willow poles, with a wheel of wood at the top to let the smoke out and the light in. You can take one down in something under an hour and put it up again in less, and it will hold heat at 40 degrees below freezing, and it will not blow away in a wind that would flatten a wooden house. The door faced south, away from the northern wind. The men's side was to the west, the women's side to the east, and the back of the tent, opposite the door, was the honored place where guests sat and where the family's few precious things were kept. Everyone knew these rules. A stranger walking into any tent on that whole grass sea knew where to put his feet, which is a kind of civilization in itself, and a more useful one than most. They ate white food and red food. White food was everything that came out of an animal while it was still alive, which is to say milk, and all the things a patient people can do with milk, soured milk, skimmed milk, curds pressed into hard little slabs and dried on the tent roof until they were nearly as tough as wood. Cream skimmed off and cooked, butter kept in a skin, and, above all, the drink they made by souring mare's milk in a leather bag and stirring it 1,000 times a day until it turned faintly fizzy and faintly alcoholic. Red food was meat, which was mostly a winter thing, because a family that eats its herd in summer is a family with nothing to milk in autumn. In the good months, a household might go for weeks without killing anything at all, and live entirely on the white food, and feel perfectly well on it. Everybody rode. This is the fact that everything else grows out of. A child was tied into a saddle before it could reliably walk, and by 5 it could take a string of horses out on its own. And by 10 it could ride all day and shoot from the saddle, and by the time it was grown it had spent more hours on a horse than most people anywhere else have spent doing anything at all. The steppe horse was small and shaggy and unimpressive to look at, with a heavy head and short legs, and it could dig through snow with its own hooves to find grass beneath. And it could carry a man 80 miles between dawn and dusk and still be alive the next morning, which the beautiful tall horses of the settled countries could not. The other thing everybody had was a bow. It was short, so that you could swing it across the neck of a horse from one side to the other, and it was built up in layers of wood and horn and sinew glued together with fish glue and left to cure for a year or more, and unstrung it curved backwards like a set of ram's horns. It could throw an arrow further than the great longbows of Western Europe. And a boy grew up shooting at gophers and marmots with it, so that by manhood he simply hit what he looked at without appearing to aim. Hunting was not a sport there. It was practice, and it was food, and once a year it was something more. Whole clans would ride out in an enormous circle, sometimes 50 miles across, and close that circle over the course of days, driving everything inside it towards the center, riders keeping station on their neighbors the entire time. It taught men to hold a line they could not see and to obey a signal from far away. Nobody thought of it as a military exercise. It simply was one. And the last thing to understand about this country is that it was not empty and it was not peaceful. The grass sea held perhaps 1 million people spread over an area the size of Western Europe, split into dozens of peoples, and those peoples were split into tribes, and the tribes into clans, and the clans into families, and all of them, at every level, were engaged in a slow, endless, exhausting rotation of raiding one another. They stole horses. That was the main business of it. Horses were wealth, horses were portable, and a herd could be taken in a night by men who knew the ground. But they also stole women, which was often how a poor man got a wife, and the stealing of a woman created a debt that her relatives were obliged to collect, and the collecting created another debt going back the other way, and so on for generations, until nobody could remember which killing had started it, and it hardly mattered, because there was always a fresh one to be going on with. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the exact problem that this whole story is an answer to. Every man on that grass was brave, mobile, well-armed, and desperately loyal to about 200 relatives. And that was as far as it went. A people who could each field a few hundred riders and who spent every summer stealing from the neighbors they would need in any real emergency could never build anything larger than a raid. To the south, the settled empires knew this perfectly well and made careful use of it. They paid one tribe to hurt another, and titles and silken grain went north to whichever chief seemed to be getting dangerous, and then went to his rival the following year, and the arrangement worked beautifully for centuries. It cost far less than an army, and it kept the grass sea busy with itself. There had been exceptions. Long before, other peoples had come out of these same pastures and frightened the world for a while, and then broken apart again, because they always broke apart. A steppe empire, historically, lasted about as long as the life of whoever made it, and sometimes not even that. When he died, his sons divided the herds. The herds became separate camps, the camps became rivals. And within a generation, the whole thing was back to horse theft and blood debts, and the settled world could go back to whatever it had been doing. So that is the country. high, cold, clean, dry, beautiful, in a manner that has nothing to do with prettiness. Almost no towns. Almost no writing, no coins in circulation, and no proper markets, and no priesthood with an ordered creed. Only sky worship and mountain worship and shamans who beat a drum and went traveling in their heads. A place where a family's entire estate could be loaded onto 4 carts, and where the only wealth that could not be stolen in a night was the good opinion of other people. Into that country, in the summer of the year 1162, or possibly 1167. Because nobody was writing anything down at the time and the 2 dates have been argued over for 800 years, a boy was born on the bank of a river called the Onon, in the northern part of the grass, up where the forest begins to come down out of the hills. His father was a man called Yasuge, a chief of a small and not especially important clan called the Borgigan, which belonged to a people who called themselves the Mongols. You should adjust your expectations here. At this point, the Mongols were not a power. They were one modest group among many on that grass, poorer than the Tatars to the east, far poorer than the Carrot in the center, and of no interest whatever to the great empires in the south. Yasuge was a chief in the sense that perhaps a few hundred people would do roughly what he said, most of the time if it suited them. His mother was called Holun, and she had arrived in his father's camp by the usual route, that is to say, she had been taken. She was of the Oak Hunut, and she had been newly married to a man of the Merkit people, and the pair of them were traveling home in a cart when Yasuge and 2 of his brothers saw her and gave chase. Her husband ran, because 3 armed men on fresh horses is an argument that does not need finishing, and the story says she pulled off her shift and threw it to him so that he would have something of hers to remember her by, and told him to go and live. Then she was carried off to the Onon, and she wept for a long while. And then she stopped weeping and set about the business of being alive where she now was, because there was nothing else to be done, and she was not a woman who wasted effort. She turned out to be the most formidable person in this early part of the story by a considerable margin, and everything her son later became, he learned first from watching her. The Merkits, of course, did not forget. Nobody forgot. Blood debts on the steppe were filed away like promissory notes, and this one would be presented for payment nearly 20 years later with interest. When the boy was born, the story that his family told afterwards was that he came into the world holding a clot of blood in his right fist, the size of a knuckle bone. Take that for what it is. Every conqueror in history acquires a birth omen sooner or later, usually after the conquering, and the people who wrote this one down were writing for his descendants. What is more likely to be true is the name. Yasuge had lately come home from a fight with the Tatars, bringing a captured chief called Temujin Uge, and he named his newborn son after the man he had just beaten. That is entirely in character for the time and place. A name was a small monument. So, Temujin, it probably means something to do with iron, or with a smith, which later generations found extremely satisfying and which was almost certainly an accident. He was the eldest of Holun's 4 sons. After him came Kassar, who grew into an enormous archer with shoulders like a cart yoke. Then Gakien, then Temuj, the youngest and the softest, whom his mother favored and who stayed close to her all her life. There was a daughter as well, Temalun, and in the other tent of the household there was Yasuge's second wife, and her 2 boys, Bekter and Belgatai, older and younger, half-brothers to the 4, and rivals in the way that half-brothers in a household with not enough food are always rivals. Of his early childhood there is almost nothing. He rode, presumably from the age of 3. He was put on the horse tail rope and taught to hold on. He learned to gather dry dung for the fire and to shoot at marmots and to know which of the tent's belongings were his own. He would have been given a bow scaled to his arms and a little bone thumb ring, and he would have spent whole days out with the sheep and come back at dusk. And none of it would have seemed to anybody like the beginning of anything at all. When he was 9, his father took him on a journey, and the journey ended his childhood. The custom was to find a wife for a son early, and to find her among the mother's people, which mattered because the mother's relatives were the only relatives on the steppe who could be counted on to help without being paid. So Yasuge put the boy on a horse and set off east towards the Okunut, Holun's kin, to make a match. On the road before they arrived, they stopped at the camp of a man of another clan, the Ongirat, who were famous for 2 things: staying out of other people's wars and having beautiful daughters. That man had a daughter 10 years old, 1 year older than the boy, and her name was Borte. Whatever passed between the 2 fathers over the milk that evening, it worked. The girl was promised, and here the custom did something that a modern listener finds strange. The boy was to be left behind. A betrothed son stayed with his future wife's family for a period, working for them, being looked at, becoming known, so that the arrangement would rest on something more than a conversation. Yasuke left his 9-year-old son in that camp and rode home alone, and his last recorded instruction was a joke about the boy being afraid of dogs and pleased would they keep the dogs away from him. That is the last thing father and son had to do with one another. On the ride home, Yasuge came across a camp of Tatars feasting on the open grass. Steppe hospitality was near absolute. A traveler who came to a fire had a right to food, even a traveler from a people you hated, and to refuse him was a serious dishonor. So he stopped and ate. The Tatars, however, recognized him. He had spent years fighting them, and he had named his own son after one of their chiefs by way of a trophy, and they were not disposed to be forgiving. Something was put in the food or the drink. He rode on and began to second. It took 3 days. He got as far as his own camp, and he lay down in his own tent, and he understood what had happened, and he sent a rider to bring his eldest son home. Then he died, and the trouble began at once. The boy came back at 9 to a camp with no chief in it. He was, by strict inheritance, his father's heir. He was also a child, and the people around him had one hard winter after another to think about, and no interest whatever in following a child. The break came at the spring sacrifice. The senior women of the ruling family, the widows of the previous generation who controlled the ceremony, held it without inviting Holun. On the steppe, that was not a slight, it was a formal announcement. It said that she and her children were no longer part of the body of the clan. Holun rode over and demanded to know what they thought they were doing, and was told, in effect, that the deep well is dry and the bright stone is broken. She got no further. Within days the clan struck their tents and moved off down the river, taking the herds, which is to say taking everything. Holun did the only thing she could think of. She seized one of the horsehair standards, the tall wooden pole with its ring of white tails that stood for the family's authority, and she rode along the line of the departing column, holding it up, calling to them, shaming them. A few families turned back out of embarrassment. One old man of the clan spoke against the abandonment out loud, which took real courage, and one of the departing chiefs put a spear in his back for it, and that was the end of the argument. By the time the dust settled, Holland was standing on the empty grass with 7 children, a handful of horses, and no herd at all. They should have died. That is the honest assessment. A family with no animals in that country in that century was a family with no food, no felt, no fuel, and no protection. And the ordinary end of such a family was to be absorbed into somebody else's camp as servants, or simply not to be there the following spring. What happened instead is the first genuinely remarkable thing in this life, and it belongs to Holland rather than to her son. She turned her children into gatherers. She went out on the hillsides with a stick of juniper wood, digging up the roots of wild pear and burnet and garlic and lily bulbs. And she taught the little ones to strip the pine trees and pull up the wild onions, and she boiled roots into a thin soup with millet when there was millet, and without it when there was not. The boys made hooks out of bent needles and fished the Onan for small fry and salmon trout, and made nets and dragged the shallows and shot marmots and ground squirrels on the slopes above the river. And once, memorably, a lark. They ate things no self-respecting steppe family would have admitted to eating. And they lived. But they lived at the bottom of the world. There is no softening this. For several years the eldest sons of a chief of the Borgigan were the poorest people on that stretch of river, dressed in whatever they could make, eating roots, invisible to everybody who mattered. A man raised in that condition either accepts for the rest of his days that he is nothing, or he acquires an idea about loyalty and betrayal so hard and so specific that it organizes the whole rest of his life. Temujin acquired the idea. The clan that had ridden away with the herds had taught him, at 9 years old, that a name and a bloodline are worth precisely nothing when there is no strength behind them, and that the people who abandon you in a bad season are exactly the people who will be smiling at you in a good one. He never forgot the families who turned back for his mother. He never forgot the ones who did not. Decades later, when he had the power to do anything he liked to anybody, that particular ledger was still open, and it was settled to the last line. Inside the little camp there was another problem, and it produced the ugliest episode of his youth. There were 2 households sharing a starvation, Holland's 4 sons, and the second wife's 2, Bector and Belguti. Bector was the older of the half-brothers, and by the reckoning of the steppe, when a father died as widows, and his sons sorted themselves out, and an older half-brother might in time take a claim over the household, and over Holland herself. Meanwhile, there was the daily matter of who ate. The boys fished together and hunted together. And the story that has come down to us is that Bector twice took what the younger boys had caught, a lark, a silver fish, small things, and in a household on roots not small at all. The 2 eldest of Holland's sons went to their mother. She told them to stop it, and reminded them that they had no friends but their own shadows, and no whip but a horse's tail, and that quarreling among themselves was the one luxury they truly could not afford. They went out anyway. Temujin and Kasar found their half-brother sitting on a rise, watching the horses, and they came at him from 2 sides, and they shot him. The account says he asked them not to harm his younger brother, and then to have sat still and let it happen. Holland's rage, when she found out, was total. She called her sons wild dogs and wolves and falcons that eat their own shadow, and she told them what they had thrown away, and it is among the very few moments in this whole account where you can hear a real human voice through 8 centuries of copying. Temujin was perhaps 13. It is not possible to like this. It is possible to understand it, in the specific sense that in a camp with one authority and not enough food, he had decided very young that a rival inside the tent was a worse danger than an enemy outside it, and that a problem left standing does not get smaller. He would apply the same reasoning to men with 100,000 followers. He applied it first to a boy on a hillside over a stolen fish. Belguti, the surviving half-brother, stayed. He served Temujin faithfully to the end and was given honors and a command, and he seems never to have said a word about it, or if he did, nobody wrote it down. The clan that had abandoned them, the Tayachid, had been keeping half an eye on the little camp by the river, and what they saw as the years went on made them uneasy. The abandoned boy was growing. He was tall, he had a following of exactly 3 younger brothers, and he was nevertheless beginning to be spoken of, which on the steppe amounts to a form of property. So one summer they came for him. He ran into the forest and stayed there for 9 days, hiding in the thickets on the slope of a mountain. And when hunger finally drove him out, they were waiting. They did not kill him, which is interesting. Instead, they put him in a kong, a heavy wooden collar of 2 boards pinned about the neck with the wrists fastened at either end, so that a man cannot feed himself, cannot scratch his own face, cannot lie down comfortably, and cannot use his hands for anything at all. Then they carried him from camp to camp, and each family in the clan took a turn at housing him, which was a way of making the humiliation general. It also meant that a large number of ordinary people got a close look at him. One night, during a feast on the first full moon of summer, the whole clan was drinking, and the boy was left in the charge of a single young guard. He swung the wooden collar and knocked the guard down with it, and ran and got as far as the river, and lay down in the shallows with only his face above the water and the collar floating, and let the current hold him against the bank while the search went past. A member of the clan called Sorkon Shira, who made mare's milk drink for a living, walked along that bank and saw him lying in the water and said nothing. He came back later and told him to stay exactly where he was until dark. When the search failed, the boy climbed out and went, of all places, to Sorkon Shira's own tent, on the reasonable calculation that someone who has once not betrayed you will find it awkward to start. The family were appalled. They hid him anyway under a pile of raw wool in a cart, which in high summer is close to being buried alive. Searchers came, poked at the wool, and left. Then Sorkon Shira cut the collar off him, burned it, gave him a horse and a bow with 2 arrows and a cooked lamb, and sent him away in the night. Every one of those people was rewarded 30 years later, in a way that made a permanent impression on everybody who heard about it. He got home. He found his mother and brothers had moved camp and tracked them by the crushed grass and rejoined them. And then, almost immediately, the family's 8 remaining horses were stolen, in daylight, by riders who simply came and took them. There was 1 horse left because his brother had been out riding it. Temujin took it and went after them alone. And here the story stops being about survival and starts being about a talent. He followed the tracks for 3 days. On the 4th he came across a young man of about his own age milking a mare beside a herd in a hollow. The young man's name was Borchu. Temujin asked whether he had seen 8 pale horses go by. Borchu had. And then, without any obvious reason for it, Borchu turned his own mount loose, saddled a fresh one, told his father nothing at all, and rode off with a total stranger to steal back somebody else's animals from armed men. They found the horses in a large camp, cut them out, and ran. A single rider came after them with a lasso pole, and Borchu asked for the bow. Temujin kept it, since the fight was not Borchu's business, and it would be a poor return for the help. They outrode the pursuit. 3 days later, they came back to Borchu's father's camp, and Temujin tried to give him half the horses, and Borchu would not take one of them, and said that he had come along as a friend, and that taking payment would make it something else. Borchu became the first man outside his own blood to follow him, and he stayed at his side for 40 years and died rich and honored and, as far as anyone can tell, entirely satisfied with the bargain. Somewhere around this time, at about 16 or 17, he remembered that he had a wife waiting. He rode east with his half-brother to the Ongirot and found the camp, and found that the girl he had been left with as a child of 9 was still there, and still promised and had not been married off to anyone else, which after 7 or 8 years of silence says something about her family and possibly something about her. Her father seems to have been quietly delighted. Borte came back west with him, and her mother sent along a wedding gift for Holon, a coat of black sable fur, the finest thing in that household by a wide margin, and worth more than every animal the family owned. And here Temujin did the single cleverest thing of his early life. He did not keep the coat. He did not sell it. He took it, with his brother and a companion, and rode south to the great camp of Togrul, the Khan of the Kerit, who was the most powerful man in the eastern grass, who commanded tens of thousands of riders, and who had once, long ago, sworn brotherhood with his dead father. He gave Togrul the sable coat and reminded him of that oath, and asked for nothing at all except to be recognized as a son. Togrul was flattered, and he was also shrewd. A young man with no herds and no followers is not a threat, and might one day be a useful arrow to have in the quiver. He accepted the coat and promised to gather the boy's scattered people for him. That coat was an investment. It bought the one thing the family did not have and could not manufacture, a patron whose name meant something, and a name on the step could be spent, which was fortunate because the old debt now came due. Word travelled to the Merkits in the north that the son of Yasuge had brought home a bride. The Merkits had never stopped resenting the theft of Holon a generation earlier, and a wife for a wife was, by their arithmetic, exactly fair. 300 riders came down on the little camp at dawn. There were not enough horses. That is the whole of it. The family had a handful of mounts and 9 or 10 people, and in the scramble the mounts went to the fighting men and to the old woman and to the sister. Borte was left. An elderly servant woman hid her in a cart under a load of wool, the same trick that had once saved her husband, and drove the cart towards the trees, and the axle broke, and the riders came up and pulled the wool apart and found her. Temujin was in the forest on the mountain, and the men who could ride were with him, and they hid there for 3 days while the Merkits searched below, and finally went home, taking his wife with them. Whatever he felt about that morning, he did not have the luxury of feeling it for long. He had perhaps a dozen followers. He had no possibility of getting her back by himself. So he went to Togrul with the debt he had bought and asked him to make it good. Togrul agreed, and he brought 20,000 riders. Then Temujin went to a second man, and the second man is the one who matters for the next 20 years. His name was Jamuka. He was a chief of the Jadaran, roughly his own age. And the pair had known each other as small boys. They had played on the ice of the frozen Onan, shot bone arrows together, and twice sworn the oath of the Anda. the sworn brother exchanging gifts and drinking a little of one another's blood in wine. That was not a sentimental gesture. In the law of the steppe, an Anda outranked a real brother. It was a legal and spiritual fact. Jamuka brought another 20,000. They fell on the Merkit camps in the night, and the fighting was short, and the Merkits scattered into the forest. And among the tents of a burning camp, with men calling names into the dark, Borte heard her husband's voice, and came out and found him. The chroniclers who wrote this down 80 years later were dry and formal men. And even they slowed down for that moment. She had been in Merkit hands for something between 8 and 9 months. She was pregnant or gave birth very soon after to a boy who was named Jochi, which means guest or visitor. Nobody then or since has been able to say with certainty whose son he was. Temujin's answer to this was immediate and permanent, and he never publicly wavered from it once. Jochi was his eldest son. Jochi was raised as his eldest son, given command of armies, given the largest and furthest share of the western lands, and treated in every formal setting as firstborn. Whatever private arithmetic went on, the man buried it and kept it buried for the whole of his life. His family did not entirely follow his lead. That single unanswerable question sat inside the household like a stone in a boot, and 40 years later, at the very end, it would decide who inherited the largest empire on earth. But we will come to that. After the rescue, the two sworn brothers stayed together. Jamuka and Temujin camped as one people for a year and a half, and by every account they were inseparable. Sharing a blanket in the old way, riding side by side, and building a joint following that grew steadily as scattered families came in to attach themselves to two young men who were clearly going somewhere. And then, on a spring day when the camp was moving to summer pasture, it ended. The account we have of the break is famously opaque. Jamuka said something about camping by the mountain and camping by the river, about horse herders and shepherds finding different ground, and rode on. Temujin did not answer him, and dropped back and repeated the remark to his mother and to Borte. Borte understood it at once, and said what she thought, that Jamuka tired of things, and had now tired of them, and that they should not stop that night, but keep going and cut away in the dark. So they did. They rode all night, and pulled clear, and by morning the two camps were separate, and as the news spread, something happened that must have astonished everybody involved, including Temujin. People began to leave Jamuka and come after him. Whole families, then whole clans. Chiefs with names older than his own. Uncles of his own dead father who had abandoned him as a child arrived and asked to be taken in. Why? Historians have argued about it for a century, and the most convincing answer is dull and enormous. Jamuka was an aristocrat, and behaved like one. He rewarded his relatives, honored rank, and shared out plunder along the lines of birth, as everyone always had. Temujin did not. He gave things to the men who had done the work, regardless of who their fathers were. He fed his followers before he fed himself. He took herdsmen and carpenters and shepherds' sons into his personal guard. He did not allow his men to loot until the fighting was completely finished, and then he divided the take by a fixed rule, including a share for the widows and children of the dead. For an ordinary man with no ancestors worth mentioning, the choice between those two futures was not a difficult one. At a gathering of his supporters, at perhaps the age of 27, they raised him up and gave him a title, Khan of the Mongols. It was not, at that point, a very large thing to be. His sworn brother, hearing of it, sent a message asking why they had needed to separate him from his anda, and then began quietly assembling everyone who disliked the new arrangement. The two of them would spend the next 20 years destroying each other. The first real battle between them came after a small and stupid incident, which is usually how these things start. A relative of Jamuka went to steal horses from one of Temujin's followers and was killed doing it. Jamuka gathered 30,000 riders. Temujin gathered about the same and came out to meet him at a place called Dalan Balshut and lost. He lost badly and pulled back into the narrows of the Onan Gorge, and Jamuka, flushed with it, did something that became the most expensive victory in steppe history. He took prisoners from the clans that had sided against him and boiled them alive in 70 great cauldrons, and cut the head off a chief and dragged it home behind his horse. On that grass, killing was ordinary. Cruelty as a public performance was not. It frightened people, and more importantly, it disgusted them, and within a season families who had fought on the winning side were riding over to the losing one. Temujin lost the battle and gained an army. He appears to have noticed the mechanism, because ever afterwards his own terror was applied with a kind of accountant's calm, always aimed at producing surrender somewhere else, never at making his own followers uncomfortable at dinner. The next years are a grinding sequence of steppe wars that would be exhausting to follow chief by chief, so let us take them at the level that matters. To the east lay the Tatars, the people who had poisoned his father. They had grown too strong and too independent for the taste of the Jin, the empire that ruled northern China. And around the year 1196, the Jin court decided to trim them and put out the usual invitation for northern allies. Togrul of the Carrot came and brought his adopted son with him. Together they broke the Tatars between them and the imperial army, and the Jin handed out titles as payment. Togrul was made a king, and the title Ong Khan stuck to him ever after. Temujin got a lesser rank, roughly a border commissioner, and something far more valuable, which was a close look at how a settled empire actually worked, and at how casually it used the people of the grass as tools. After that campaign, he did something that had never been done. Having beaten a rival people, the custom was to take their herds, kill or enslave the men, and absorb the women and the young. Instead, he ordered that the surviving Tatars be distributed as full members among Mongol families, adopted, not enslaved, and that the name of the tribe be dissolved. Holin took in a Tatar orphan and raised him as her own son. Temujin himself later married 2 Tatar sisters, and one of them, Yesui, grew into one of the strongest influences on his life. He did the same thing again and again as he went. Beaten peoples were not kept as beaten peoples. They were broken up, and their families were spread through his own units so that within a generation no one could remember which tribe they had come from, only which regiment. It is among the great administrative ideas of the Middle Ages, and it was invented by an illiterate herdsman with a grudge. The other thing he did in these years was to write down, or rather to have proclaimed, a set of rules for his own people, and to enforce them with an absolute lack of interest in who your father was. Looting during a battle was forbidden. Everyone fights until the fighting is over, then the spoils are gathered centrally and divided by rule. Abandoning a comrade was forbidden on pain of death. Stealing a horse carried a penalty so heavy that horse theft, the oldest industry of the steppe, quietly ceased to be worth doing. Kidnapping and selling women was forbidden. So was the taking of anything from anyone who had already surrendered. All faiths were to be left alone, and the holy men of every religion of whatever kind were exempted from tax and from military service. If you found a lost animal or a dropped bow on the road, you were required to return it to its owner. If you took anything from a household you had been quartered in, it went badly for you. Some of this was moral. Most of it was structural. He was building an army out of men who had spent 1,000 years robbing each other. And the only way to do that was to make robbery among themselves more dangerous than any enemy. Meanwhile, his old patron was becoming a problem. Ong Khan of the Carrot was elderly and vain, and surrounded by a court of relatives who watched the rise of the young Mongol with growing alarm. His son, Sengum, expected to inherit and could count. Jamuka, who had failed to beat Temujin in the field, took the sensible route and went to work on the old man's ear instead. The break came over a marriage. Temujin proposed that his eldest son should marry Ong Khan's daughter, and that his own daughter should go to Sengum's son. It was a perfectly ordinary proposal between allies of equal standing, and that was exactly the problem. It announced that he considered himself of equal standing. The Carrot Court took it as an insult, refused, and then, having refused, understood that they had just made an enemy of the most capable man on the grass. So they invited him to a feast to celebrate the marriage after all, and arranged to kill him when he arrived. He set off with 2 companions. On the road, he stopped at the tent of a herdsman for the night, and the herdsman's household knew what was waiting at the other end and told him. And he turned around and rode home, and the trap closed on nothing. But the secret was out on both sides now, and the Carrot came after him in force. He was caught badly outnumbered at a place called the Red Willows, and the fighting went on all day. And his 3rd son was hit in the neck by an arrow, and one of his oldest companions spent the night sucking the clotted blood out of the wound and spitting it away, and then crept into the enemy camp and stole a bucket of curds because the boy needed to drink something. By the end of it, his army had come apart. Men scattered into the hills in 1s and 2s. When he finally stopped running, somewhere out in the eastern grass near a shallow, silty lake, he had lost almost everything. And now we're back at the muddy water at the beginning of the night. The lake was called Baljuna. It was late spring or early summer, and it was hot, and the water was low and filthy. There were 19 men with him, and the accounts of who exactly they were disagree in the details, but they agree on the thing that made it famous. They were not his relatives. Among the 19 were Christians and Muslims and Buddhists and shamanists. There were Mongols and men of the Carrot and the Merkit and other peoples he had fought, and at least one Muslim merchant who had wandered into the story with a flock of sheep and stayed. A brother arrived later, having lived for days on nothing, having lost his wife and children entirely. They had no food. They cooked a horse. Then they drank the muddy water together, and swore that whatever came, they would hold to one another, and that if he rose, they would share it. That oath became the founding legend of the empire. For the rest of his life, a man who could say that he had drunk the water of the Baljuna needed to say nothing else about his standing. And the composition of that little group is the whole political argument of his career in a single image, a mixed set of men from every people and every god, bound by choice and by nothing else, because everything else had been taken from them. It was the lowest point of his life, and it was also the last one. From that muddy lake, the line goes upward without a serious break for the next 24 years. He rebuilt within months. He sent messages of astonishing patience to Ong Khan, laying out the whole history of their relationship, item by item, in the manner of a man presenting an itemist bill, and the old man's court fell to arguing among themselves about it. Then, in the autumn, with the carrot relaxed and holding a feast, he marched at night, surrounded their camp before dawn, and fought for 3 days until it was finished. Ong Khan himself got away and rode west, and was stopped at a border post by men of the Naiman who did not recognize him, and who did not believe some old man in ruined clothes claiming to be the greatest king of the eastern steppe. They killed him without ever finding out. His son fled south into the desert and died there. The Cariot, one of the 2 largest peoples of the grass, ceased to exist as a people. Their families were distributed, their princesses were married into the new order, and one of them, a serious and highly educated Christian woman named Sorkatani, was given to his youngest son, and she would turn out to be one of the most consequential mothers in world history. But that is a story for the end. Only one great power remained. The Naiman, in the West, sophisticated and literate and confident, with a court that used a written script and employed a chancellor and looked upon the eastern Mongols as smelly and ill-dressed. Jamuka, having run out of other options, was with them. The Naiman queen, hearing that the Mongols were coming, reportedly remarked that their clothes were filthy and that perhaps somebody could wash them before they were brought to the tent, which is the sort of comment that gets remembered for 800 years for reasons the speaker cannot possibly have intended. The Mongols were badly outnumbered, so on the night before the battle, Temujin had every man light 5 fires instead of 1. Spread across the hills until the Naiman scouts reported an army the size of a nation. Then, in the morning, he came at them in a formation he had drilled and named. Advance like grass, deploy like a lake, fight like a chisel. The Naiman king was mortally wounded on a mountainside while Jamuka, watching from beside him, described the approaching Mongol commanders one by one in poetic terms that grew steadily more alarming, and then quietly rode away. That was the end of the Naiman, and the end of independent politics on the Grass Sea. Jamuka lasted a little longer as a fugitive, hunted with 5 companions. In the end, those companions seized him and delivered him to Temujin, expecting a reward. They were executed on the spot, in front of the man they had betrayed, on the principle that a servant who sells his master is of no use to anyone. What was then said between the 2 sworn brothers has come down in a form far too neat to be a transcript, but the shape of it is probably true. Jamoka asked to die, said there was only room for 1 sun in the sky, refused an offer of reconciliation, and asked for the death owed to a man of rank, without blood spilled and with his bones buried high up where he could look over the country. It was granted. He was wrapped and broken and buried, and his sworn brother is said to have been quiet for a long time afterwards. In the spring of 1206, at the head of the Onan River, in the country where he had once dug roots to stay alive, every people of the eastern grass gathered in one place. A great assembly of that kind was called a Kurultai, and it was part parliament, part festival, and part enormous wedding. Families came in from 600 miles away and camped in rings out across the valley until the white felt tents covered the flats to the horizon. There were races and wrestling and archery and vast quantities of soured mare's milk and the settling of 1,000 small disputes that had been saved up for the occasion. At the heart of it, a 9-tailed white standard was raised, made from the tail hair of white stallions, and the assembled peoples confirmed a title on a man who had spent 30 years getting to that valley. He was proclaimed Genghis Khan. The exact meaning has been argued over ever since. It may mean oceanic, or firm, or fierce, or universal. The general sense is unmistakable, not the Khan of a tribe, but the Khan of everything under the sky. He was somewhere in his early 40s. He had been an abandoned child with 4 brothers and no herd. He now commanded, by a fair estimate, about 1 million people and perhaps 105,000 riders, which does not sound like very much until you remember that every single one of them could ride 100 miles in a day, shoot from the saddle at full gallop, live for weeks on dried milk curd and dried meat carried under the saddle, and be replaced from a pool of remounts of 5 or 6 horses per man. And then, instead of doing what every steppe conqueror before him had done, which was to celebrate for a season and then go and raid somebody, he sat down and rebuilt his society from the ground up. This is the part of the life that gets the least attention and deserves the most. First, he abolished the tribes. Not the names, not the memories, but the tribe as a unit of organization. The whole population was reorganized into a decimal structure, units of 10, 10 of those making 100, 10 hundreds making 1,000, 10 thousands making a tumen. A man belonged to his 10. He could not leave it. He could not transfer to another under any circumstances, and the penalty for trying was death, and so was the penalty for the unit that accepted him. Within the 10, the men elected their own leader. Above that, appointments were made from the top on merit, and the great commanders of the empire were duly a carpenter's son, a herdsman, a man from a defeated enemy tribe who had once put an arrow through Temujin's horse and had said so honestly to his face when asked, and been promoted for it and given the name Hebe, meaning arrow. The consequence was that the 95,000 unit commanders and their families were now bound to him rather than to any ancestral chief, and that a Carrot, a Tatar, a Merkit, and a Mongol who had been enemies a decade earlier now shared a cooking fire and a collective punishment. Within one generation, the old identities were gone, and everyone on the grass simply called themselves Mongol. That was the point. Second, he built a personal guard, the Keshig, of 10,000 men. Its members were the sons and brothers of commanders, which made them useful hostages, but that is only half of it. The guard was a school. Its men served in rotation as the Khan's cooks, doorkeepers, quiver bearers, grooms, secretaries, and night watch, learning administration from the inside, and then went out to command armies. The lowest-ranking man of the guard outranked a commander of 1,000 in the ordinary army, and every one of them was known to the Khan personally. Nothing like a professional officer corps had existed anywhere in that part of the world. Third, he had the law written down. He had no writing of his own. The Mongols had never needed any. But among the captives from the Naiman court there was a scribe, a man of the weirs, found carrying the royal seal in his coat and trying to return it to his dead master's heir out of duty. That impressed his captor considerably, and the scribe, Datotonga, was set to work at once teaching the Uyghur alphabet to the sons of the Khan and adapting it to the Mongol tongue. It was a vertical script written in columns down the page, and it is still in use today. A man unable to read a word of it ordered it into existence and then had the entire body of his decisions recorded in it in blue books and made his relatives study them. The body of that law is usually called the Great Yasa. No complete copy survives, which is one of the enduring frustrations of the subject, and what we have is reconstructed from quotations by later writers. But the recurring provisions are consistent enough to trust in outline. Loyalty is absolute and betrayal is capital, including betrayal of somebody else's master. All faiths are equal and none is taxed. Clergy of every religion and doctors, teachers, and undertakers are exempt from taxes and from service. Water is not to be fouled, and no one may urinate into running water or wash in it. In a country where a poisoned stream can kill a valley, fire is sacred and food may not be wasted. Animals are to be killed in a particular way, quietly, with the blood kept, and not butchered in public with much noise. Adultery is punished with death. So is theft of a horse, and lying to the Khan, and stealing from the dead on the battlefield, and taking anything from a household you are quartered in. Debts must be honored, but a man may be forgiven his debt 3 times before he is punished. Envoys are inviolable, always, everywhere, without exception. That last clause looks like a minor diplomatic nicety. It would burn a civilization to the ground. Fourth, he built a communication system, and it may be the single most modern thing about him. The Yam was a relay of post stations set roughly a long day's ride apart along the main routes, each station keeping horses, riders, fodder, food, and a place to sleep maintained by the local population as their tax. A messenger with the proper tablet of authority could arrive, hand over his packet, take a fresh mount and go on, or hand a packet to a fresh man entirely. Riders bound their torsos in tight belts and slept in the saddle, and the fastest of them could cover something near 200 miles in a day after day. A message could cross the breadth of Asia in a fortnight, which no state managed again until the invention of the telegraph. It meant that a commander 3,000 miles from his Khan was not, in practice, out of contact. Fifth, he took a census, because you cannot tax or conscript what you have not counted, and he set fixed rates rather than allowing his officers to help themselves. Sixth, he set up a supreme judge for the whole nation and gave the post to his adopted brother, the Tatar orphan his mother had raised, with orders to record every judgment and every division of property in writing, so that nothing depended on anyone's memory. And seventh, in a decision whose effects are still visible on the map today, he made the trade routes safe. Merchants were protected, given passports, and offered generous prices at the imperial camp. Caravans were guaranteed compensation if they were robbed inside his territory. A whole continent's worth of middlemen suddenly discovered that the terrifying nomads were the best customers and the safest hosts on the road. All of this was done by a man who could not read, in a country with no cities. No coinage, no bureaucracy, and no precedent in the space of about 3 years. There was one more piece of business, and it was domestic and unpleasant, and it shows something. Among his earliest supporters was a family of shamans, and the most powerful of them was a man called Teb Tengri, who had been the one to announce publicly that heaven had granted the earth to Temujin, and who had a considerable following of his own. Success went to his head. He began gathering people to himself, then had the Khan's brother Kassar seized and beaten, and then went to the Khan and warned him that heaven had shown him a vision in which the succession alternated between the 2 brothers. Temujin, who was not immune to that kind of talk, had his own brother arrested, until Holin heard about it. She got into a white camel cart deep in the night, drove to her son's camp, arrived at dawn, went straight in, untied Kesar herself and sat down with her sons in front of her. Then she bared her breast and said, more or less, that these were what her sons had fed on, and asked her eldest, what kind of creature devours his own brother? Her son apologized. Then, when she was out of the tent, he quietly stripped Kesar of most of his followers anyway, which is a very fair summary of his entire character in one anecdote: publicly repentant, privately unswerving. The shaman then overreached again by insulting the youngest brother, and this time the wives spoke. Borte sat up in the family tent and said the thing out loud: that a man who beat one brother today and humiliated another tomorrow would come for the sons in due course, and that if the shaman was allowed to keep going, everything her husband had built out of nothing would go to pieces the moment he was gone. He listened to his wife. Arrangements were made. The next time the shaman came into the tent, 3 strong wrestlers took him outside, and his back was broken without a drop of blood spilled, which was the honorable form, and the body was placed in a cart. It was announced that heaven had removed him for his arrogance. His father was pardoned and told to keep his remaining sons in order. No shaman ever again attempted to set himself above the Khan, and religion in the Mongol Empire remained permanently a servant of the state rather than a rival to it. He was now the master of the Grass Sea, from the forests of Siberia to the edge of the Gobi, from the Altai to the country of the Manchurian rivers. He was in his middle 40s, which in that place and time was old. Everything he had done so far, he had done to survive. Everything he did from this point on, he did because he could. And here we should be honest about the turn the story now takes, because the second half of this life is very different from the first, and no amount of admiration for the administration can soften it. The man who had built the most disciplined and best organized state on the steppe now pointed it outward. What follows is the story of a man in his 50s and 60s spending his talent on other people's cities, and the numbers involved are of a kind that the world had not seen before and would not see again for a very long time. Before we follow him south, let us slow down and look properly at the thing he had built, because it is easy to say that the Mongol army was fast and hard to imagine what that actually meant in practice, and imagining it is a pleasant way to spend a few quiet minutes on the edge of sleep. Begin with the horses, because everything begins with the horses. A rider did not have a horse. He had a string of them, 4 or 5, sometimes more, and they traveled with him as a small private herd, following the mare he had trained to lead them. He changed mounts several times a day, so that no animal carried weight for more than a few hours, and a horse that has been rested and grazed for 2 days out of 3 will keep going for a month. That is the whole secret of Mongol speed, and it is hardly a secret at all. It is arithmetic that every other army of the age could have done, and none of them could afford, because their horses ate grain which had to be carried, and grain that is carried has to be carried by more horses which eat more grain. The steppe pony ate grass. Grass was already there. The animals were mares as often as geldings, because a mare gives milk, and a rider with mares in his string carried a food supply that walked itself and refilled every morning. Then the food. A man's saddlebags held dried curd, hard as slate, which could be broken up and shaken in a skin of water with the motion of the horse, until by evening it was a thick sour drink. He carried strips of meat that had been dried in the wind, and sometimes meat pounded to a powder so fine that the contents of a whole cow could be stuffed into an ox bladder, and a handful of it made soup. He carried millet if there was any. He carried nothing else. An army supplied like that has no supply train worth mentioning, and an army with no supply train cannot be cut off, cannot be starved out, and never has to slow down for the wagons. If it came to it, and it did come to it on the hardest rides, a man could open a small vein in the neck of one of his horses, take a drink of blood, close the cut, and go on. The animal was none the worse for it a day later. There is no more concentrated illustration of the difference between that army and the ones it met. The clothing was felt and hide and quilted layers, with a hat with ear flaps and boots with turned-up toes so the foot did not dig into the ground when leading a horse. Under the outer coat, many of them wore a shirt of raw silk, and this was not luxury. An arrowhead striking silk tends to carry the unbroken cloth into the wound with it, and the shirt can then be drawn back out, bringing the head with it, instead of a surgeon digging for barbs. Silk shirts were issued as equipment. Whether the men appreciated the elegance of the idea is not recorded. The bow we have already met, and the arrows deserve a note of their own. Different heads for different jobs, heavy ones for armor, light ones for distance. Some with a pierced bone bulb behind the point that made a howling whistle in flight, used for signaling and, incidentally, for frightening the enemy's horses. A man carried perhaps 60 arrows in 2 quivers, and there were baggage carts of spares, and every unit had someone who could make more. Then the discipline, which would have astonished a European knight most of all. The unit of 10 was collectively responsible. If one man ran, all 10 were punished. If one man was captured and the others left him, all of them died for it. If a man dropped a piece of equipment on the march, the rider behind him was required to pick it up and return it, and would be punished if he did not. There was no plunder until the commander said the battle was over, and the punishment for early looting was death, which meant that a broken enemy could not buy time by scattering valuables behind them, a tactic that had worked against nomad armies for 1,000 years. Orders were given by signal, not by shouting. Flags by day, colored lanterns by night, and drums and those whistling arrows for emphasis. Contemporary accounts keep returning almost nervously to the quiet, an army of tens of thousands maneuvering in near silence and changing direction all at once, as if the whole field were being moved by one hand. They practiced in the winter hunt, which had become an institution. The whole army would form an enormous ring, tens of miles across, and close it over weeks, driving every living animal inside towards the center, with commanders judged on whether their section of the line kept perfect station with their neighbors. A gap was a disgrace. A rider who let an animal slip through the line was answerable for it. At the end, in the closed circle, the Khan rode in first, and then the princes, and then the ordinary men, and finally, by custom, the oldest of them came forward to ask that the remaining animals be released, and they were, so that the herds would not be destroyed. It was the finest training exercise ever devised, and it fed the army. And nobody had to invent a word for war games because it simply was hunting. Movement then, a tumen of 10,000 did not travel as one dense column, because 10,000 horses eat a strip of grass bare, and the men behind them go hungry. They traveled dispersed, sometimes across 60 or 80 miles of front, each unit on its own line of march with its own pastures, in constant contact by rider, and converged on a place and a day agreed in advance. To an enemy, this meant that scouts reported small parties everywhere and no army anywhere, and then one morning there was an army. Ahead of all of it went the scouts and the intelligence, and this is where the Mongols were furthest ahead of everyone else. They interrogated merchants. They bought information. They kept captured officials. They knew the state of the roads, the harvests, the politics, and the family quarrels of a country long before they entered it, and they chose their targets accordingly, and when they arrived, they knew which lord hated his king. Behind them came the engineers, and behind the engineers the herds, and behind the herds the carts of the families. Because on a long campaign the wives and children came too, which is why the Mongol advance did not have a rear in the ordinary sense. And they took winter for their campaigning season wherever they could. Because the rivers of Russia and China freeze, and a frozen river is a paved road running through a country that thought its rivers were walls. Put all of that together, and you have an army that could cover in a week what its enemies covered in a month, appear from a direction with no road in it, fight for a season without supplies, hold a formation without shouting, and lose a battle without breaking, since a feigned retreat and a genuine one look identical until the moment the line turns and comes back at you. Nobody in the settled world had seen anything like it, and the deepest reason is almost embarrassing in its simplicity. Everyone else's army was a special thing, assembled from a farming population that had to be taken away from the harvest, armed at great expense, and taught its business. His was a population, doing on campaign broadly what it did at home, on the animals it lived on anyway, using the skills it used for its dinner. The Mongols did not have to build an army, they had to organize one. And organizing things, it turned out, was the particular talent of a man who had been left on the grass at 9 years old and had spent every year since working out precisely what makes people stay. South of the Gobi, along the great northern bend of the Yellow River, there was a kingdom called Shixia, ruled by a people called the Tangut. It was small by Chinese standards and rich by any standard, sitting across the trade roads where the caravans came out of the west, with irrigated fields, walled towns, a Buddhist scholarship of its own, and a script of its own that nobody outside it could read. It was also, crucially, the weakest of the settled states on his border, and it paid tribute to nobody. He went at it 3 times, in stages over several years, and a campaign was an education. The first raids were reconnaissance dressed as robbery. The second went further and ran into the thing that no steppe army had ever solved: a wall. Mongol riders in open country were the best light cavalry the world has ever seen. Against a walled city with a garrison, a moat, and a rammed earth rampart 40 feet thick, they were a crowd of men on horses standing outside in the weather, and everybody inside knew it. Historically, the nomad answer had been to burn the countryside, take what was outside the walls, and go home before winter, and the cities had simply shut their gates and waited it out for 1,000 years. He would not accept that. So he set about learning, in his 50s, an entire branch of warfare that his people had never practiced. The first attempt was a self-inflicted disaster, and is worth telling because he told it against himself afterwards. Besieging the Tongan capital and finding the walls too much, he had his men build a dike to divert the Yellow River against the city. The engineering was ambitious, and the execution was amateur. The dike broke, and the water came out the wrong way and flooded the Mongol camp instead, and the army had to pull back to higher ground, looking extremely foolish. The Tongut king, however, had also had a bad war. The Jin, from whom he had requested help, had declined to send any on the pleasant reasoning that 2 enemies fighting each other was a benefit rather than a problem. So the king came to terms, gave a daughter in marriage, and began paying tribute in camels, falcons, woolen cloth, and, above all, silk. Shia became a vassal. And the Mongols went home with something more valuable than the silk, a working knowledge of how a siege is done, and the first Chinese engineers to enter their service. From then on, the pattern is fixed. Every campaign added a technical department. Chinese and later Persian engineers built counterweight trebuchets that could throw a stone the weight of a man 300 yards and take down a gate tower in an afternoon. Naphtha throwers, incendiaries, gunpowder bombs, siege towers, scaling ladders on carts, portable bridges, the whole apparatus of settled warfare was absorbed and carried along by an army that had begun as herdsmen with bows. Captured populations were sorted by usefulness. Craftsmen, doctors, translators, engineers, scribes, and astronomers were separated out, spared, and moved, sometimes across a continent to wherever they were needed. It was brutal, and it was also, in its way, the largest deliberate transfer of technical skill that had happened in human history. That done, he turned to the Jin. The Jin Empire ruled all of northern China. It had perhaps 50 million subjects, walled cities beyond counting, a professional bureaucracy, standing armies with cavalry of their own, and the accumulated confidence of a state that had been collecting tribute from the northern tribes since before the Khan was born. It had also, for generations, made a policy of thinning out the steppe peoples by encouraging them to fight one another, and had executed a Mongol chief of an earlier generation, a relative of his, by nailing him to a wooden donkey. Nothing on that grass was ever forgotten. The occasion was a formality. A new Jin emperor came to the throne and sent an envoy north to receive the customary submission. The Khan received the message, turned to the south, spat, mounted his horse, and rode away, which, as diplomatic communications go, is admirably brief. That spring, in 1211, he crossed the Gobi with something like 90,000 men and did not come home for 4 years. The Gobi crossing alone should be sat with for a moment. It is 600 miles of gravel and scrub with almost no water, and he took an army over it, time to arrive when the desert grasses came up after rain. Moving with remount herds so that no horse carried a man for more than a fraction of the journey. The Jin generals had assumed the desert was a wall. It was, for infantry. For a nation that had spent 1,000 years learning where the water was, it was a road with no one on it. Then the Great Wall, which was not at that date the continuous stone monument you are picturing, but a system of rammed earth walls, forts, and garrisoned passes. The Mongols went through it partly by fighting, and partly because the men holding a key section were Khitans, a people the Jin had conquered a century before and who had spent that century waiting for exactly this opportunity. They opened the gates and changed sides in large numbers, and one Khitan prince of the old royal house came over and became an advisor. And a Khitan-led rebellion opened up behind the Jin lines in the east. The first years were open field warfare, and the Jin lost. They lost at a pass called the Badger's Mouth, where a Jin army of enormous size was caught in a defile and destroyed, and the accounts speak of bones lying on that ground for years afterwards. They lost their northern provinces piece by piece. And every autumn the Mongols withdrew north to fatten their horses, and every spring they came back, which is a thing settled armies find almost impossible to plan against. But the cities held. They held for a long time. The Mongols would take a walled town, and the next one would shut its gates, and a siege in China could take months of building and mining and battering while a mounted army stood still and grew bored and sick. There is a case that this was the least efficient phase of his whole career. His answer was refugees. Wherever the field army moved, it drove the rural population ahead of it towards the cities, which then had to feed them, and the granaries emptied faster than any battering ram could work. It was deliberate. It was also, in the plainest terms, a method of starving people who had never had anything to do with the quarrel. And there was the standing offer, which he made everywhere and honored with a consistency that terrified people far more than any threat. A city that opened its gates before the first arrow was shot would keep its lives, its property, and its religion, and pay a tax. A city that resisted and then fell would be treated as a rebel. There was no third option and no renegotiation once the arrows had started. Cities which took the offer were left standing, and merchants and clergy in them went on with their business under new management. Cities which refused were made into examples, and the survivors were driven ahead of the army to the next set of walls to describe what they had seen. Terror, used that way, is a form of arithmetic. It reduced the number of sieges he had to fight, which reduced his losses, and he never once pretended it was anything other than a tool. In 1213, the Mongol columns went south in 3 groups and stripped the countryside between the Yellow River and the sea. In 1214, they stood before the Jin capital, Zhengdu, which is buried under modern Beijing. They could not take it. That is the fact behind what happened next. The walls were 40 feet high and ran for miles, with hundreds of towers and a triple moat, and disease had got into the Mongol camp, and the horses had eaten the surrounding country bare. So he negotiated, and the Jin emperor bought him off with a colossal indemnity, a princess of the imperial house, 500 young men and 500 young women, 3,000 horses, and enough gold and silk to load the carts to the axles. The Mongols withdrew north with the loot, and the Jin court, having survived, immediately made the single worst decision of the dynasty. Judging the capital indefensible, the emperor moved his government south to Kaifeng, behind the Yellow River. To a steppe mind, moving your court out of a city you have just paid to keep is a confession that the treaty was a lie and the war is still on. He turned around and came back. Zhengdu, abandoned by its own government and with its relief convoys intercepted, held out for another year in conditions that do not bear description and fell in the summer of 1215. The sack lasted a month. A Khwarezmian embassy that arrived shortly afterwards reported that the ground outside the walls was greasy with human fat and that the streets were slippery. And this was written by men who had come to negotiate a trade agreement and had no particular interest in exaggerating. Among the prisoners taken out of the wreckage was a tall young man with a beard down to his waist, a Khitan of the old royal line, an astronomer, and a Confucian scholar named Yelu Chukai. He was brought before the Khan, who observed that the Jin had destroyed his family's dynasty and that he had therefore been avenged. The young man answered that his father and grandfather had served the Jin loyally, and that it would be dishonest for him to pretend enmity towards a house he had served. That answer could very easily have been the end of him. Instead, he was taken into service on the spot and became the most important civil official of the empire. And for the next 30 years, he was the voice in the room arguing for taxing people instead of killing them. When Mongol generals proposed clearing northern China of farmers entirely to make pasture, on the grounds that farmers were of no use, it was Yelu Chukai who sat down and worked out what the same land would produce annually in grain. Silk and silver if the people on it were left alive and taxed properly. He produced the number won the argument. Millions of people who never heard his name lived because an astronomer could do sums. The Jin War was not finished and would not be finished for another 20 years. But the Khan had had enough of it personally. He left his best commander, Mukali, in the north with a modest force and full authority, gave him a golden seal, and told him that everything north of the Gobi was his to command, and turned his attention west, where a much older interest lay: the roads and the caravans and the enormous, rich, unfamiliar world at the other end of them. It is worth stopping here for a moment before the story leaves Asia and looking sideways at the rest of the world as it stood while all this was happening, because it is very easy to read a life like this as though it took place on an empty stage. At the far western end of the same continent, in a wet, green island off the coast of Europe, a group of barons was preparing to force an unpopular king to put his seal to a charter in a riverside meadow, and the document they produced would be annulled by a pope within 10 weeks, and would go on to be quoted for 8 centuries. In the same decade, the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris was a building site, and had been for 50 years, and would be for another 60. The universities of Bologna and Paris and Oxford were young and disorderly institutions of a few hundred quarrelsome men. And in Oxford the students had recently gone on strike, and some of them had wandered off to a marshy town called Cambridge and started another one. Christendom had, a few years earlier, mounted a crusade that never reached the Holy Land at all. It had been diverted by debts and Venetian shipping arrangements, and it ended with a Christian army sacking Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world, and carrying off its bronze horses. In Spain, the long, grinding Reconquest had just turned decisively at a pass in the Sierra Morena. In southern France, a crusade was being preached against other Christians. Europe at this moment was busy, energetic, violent, and, from the perspective of Asia, extremely provincial. Nobody in Paris or London had any clear idea what lay east of the Holy Land, and the maps beyond that point were furnished with rumor. In the Islamic world, the caliph sat in Baghdad, in a city with a house of learning, paved streets, hospitals with separate wards, public baths, and a book market, presiding over a spiritual authority that had long since stopped being a political one. Cairo and Damascus were rich and crowded and confident. The libraries of Persia and Central Asia held the accumulated mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy of 5 centuries, much of it inherited from the Greeks and improved beyond recognition. And there were more books in the city of Merv than in most European kingdoms put together. All of that was about to encounter a man from the grass who could not read. In India, a Turkish sultanate had recently established itself at Delhi and was building a tower of red sandstone to celebrate. Further south, the temple cities went about their business as they had for centuries. In Southeast Asia, the great stone city among the reservoirs of Angkor was at its height, feeding perhaps 750,000 people from an engineered landscape of canals and rice, the largest pre-industrial city on earth, and in a few generations it would be abandoned to the forest for reasons that are still being argued over. To the immediate south of the Mongol homeland, beyond the Jin, lay the Song Empire, and the Song were quietly the most technologically advanced society on the planet. They had printing with movable type and paper money and blast furnaces producing iron on a scale that Europe would not match for 600 years, and the magnetic compass at sea and gunpowder weapons and locks on their canals, and a professional civil service chosen by written examination, and cities of 1 million inhabitants with restaurants that specialized, and fire brigades, and public clocks driven by water. A traveler from London arriving in the song capital would have understood almost nothing of what he was looking at. Across the ocean, in the valleys of the Andes, the small kingdoms that would become the Inca were still small. On the Mississippi, the great earthwork city at Cahokia was past its peak and emptying. In West Africa, the gold of the upper Niger was moving north across the Sahara in camel caravans towards the Mediterranean, and the kingdom that would become Mali was gathering itself. In southern Africa, the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe were rising above a cattle country trading gold and ivory to the Indian Ocean. And in Japan, an aristocratic court had recently lost control to a military government of warrior families whose descendants would, 60 years later, watch 2 Mongol fleets sail towards them and be saved twice by weather. None of these places knew about the others in any detail. The Mediterranean knew a little about India, and India knew something about China, and China knew a great deal about Central Asia. And the knowledge thinned rapidly with distance, and beyond a certain radius the map simply stopped and the monsters began. What the next century did, for the first time in human history, was join a good part of that up. It joined it up at the point of a bow, which is not the joining anybody would have chosen. But a Franciscan friar from Italy would shortly ride to Mongolia and come home to write a report on the customs of a people nobody in Europe had heard of. A French king would receive envoys from Asia and send some back. A Flemish monk would sit in a tent at Karakoram and describe the silver fountain and argue theology with a Muslim and a Buddhist before a Khan and write it all down for his king. A Venetian family would go and stay, and Chinese doctors would work in Persian hospitals, and Persian astronomers would set up an observatory in China, and Mongolian would be written in 3 alphabets by scribes who spoke 6 languages. None of that was intended by anybody. It was the accidental result of one family deciding that the roads between here and there should belong to them, and then policing those roads with an efficiency that made travel on them worth the risk. From that century onward, an event at one end of Asia had consequences at the other, and the world has never gone back to being several separate worlds since. Now back to the felt tent, and to a man in his late 50s with a beard going gray and a great deal of unfinished business, turning his face towards the west. West of his own pastures lay a country called Kara Kitai, a state founded generations earlier by Khitan refugees fleeing the very jinn he had just been fighting. It had been taken over by an adventurer, a Naiman prince called Kuklug, the son of the king who had died on the mountainside, who had fled west after the last battle on the grass, married the local ruler's daughter, and then deposed him. Kuklug was a bad ruler in a very specific and useful way. He had converted, and he began persecuting the Muslim majority of his own cities, closing prayer in the towns of the oasis, and in one town had a senior scholar nailed to the door of his own school. The population loathed him. The Khan sent Jebe, the archer who had once shot his horse, with 20,000 riders and a simple instruction: proclaim that every man may worship as he pleases, and see what happens. What happened was that the cities opened their gates from the inside. Kuklug was hunted across the mountains into the high valleys of Badakhshan, where local hunters caught him and handed him over. At a stroke, and at almost no cost, the Mongol frontier moved 1,000 miles west and now touched the border of the largest and richest state in the Islamic world. That state was the Empire of Khwarezm. It ran from the Aral Sea down through Persia to the edge of Iraq and east to the mountains of Afghanistan, and it contained cities that had been centers of learning for 500 years: Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Nishapur, Urgench, Herat, Balkh. It had a young and ambitious ruler, Shah Muhammad, an army on paper considerably larger than the Mongol one, and a great deal of internal trouble. Because the Shah did not trust his own Turkish generals, his own mother ran a rival court with her own faction, and the religious establishment despised him. The Khan's first approach to this empire was, of all things, commercial. He sent an embassy, proposing peace and open trade, describing himself as master of the East and the Shah as master of the West, and suggesting that merchants should pass freely between them. The Shah's court found the tone patronizing, which it probably was, but the agreement was made. Then came the caravan. It was a large one, 450 merchants with camels loaded with silver, jade, ivory, silk, and furs, licensed by the Khan, sent to trade at the frontier city of Otrar on the Sirdarya. The governor of Otrar, a relative of the Shah's mother, looked at the goods, decided they were spies, and had them all killed and the entire cargo confiscated. One camel driver hid in a bathhouse and got out and rode east for 6 weeks to say what had happened. Now recall the one clause in the law that was absolute. Envoys are inviolable, everywhere, without exception. The Khan did not immediately go to war. This is often forgotten. He sent 3 ambassadors, 1 Muslim and 2 Mongols, with a demand that the governor of Otrar be handed over for punishment, and an offer to treat the whole thing as the crime of a single official rather than an act of state. The Shah had the senior ambassador executed and the other 2 shaved of their beards and sent home, which in that world was a calculated humiliation. He is said to have gone up onto a mountain alone after that, uncovered his head, loosened his belt, and stayed there for 3 days. What followed was, by any measure anyone has ever managed to apply, one of the most destructive events in recorded history, and it started with a customs official who wanted a load of silver. Before he went, there was a family matter to settle, and it was raised by a wife. Yasui, the Tatar woman who had become one of his senior consorts, asked him in open assembly what would happen to his people when his body, like an old tree, eventually fell. She pointed out that he was going a very long way at his age, and that 4 sons and a nation with no named heir was a recipe for exactly the collapse that had ended every steppe empire before his. So he asked his eldest son to speak first. Before Joki could answer, his second son, Chagatai, spoke over him and asked whether they were to be ruled by the Murkit bastard. Both of them were on their feet with fistfuls of each other's collars before the guards separated them. It was the one thing in that family that had never been said aloud in his father's hearing, and now it had been said in front of everybody. The father let the silence sit. Then an old companion reminded the second son what his mother had suffered, and that no man had the right to make a woman's misfortune her disgrace, and the father said flatly that Jochi was his eldest son, and that nobody was to speak of him in that way again. Chagatai, cornered, proposed a compromise. Neither he nor Jochi, but their third brother, Ogede, Jochi agreed. Ogede, who was easygoing, generous, drank far too much and had no ambition whatever, was named heir, which turned out to be a better choice than it sounds, because he was the one man all his brothers could tolerate. The youngest, Louis, was to inherit the homeland and the bulk of the army, according to the steppe custom by which the youngest son keeps the hearth. It was settled. It was not, as we shall see, settled at all. Then he took his army west. The size of it is disputed, and the honest figure is somewhere between 100 and 150,000 men, with 3 or 4 horses each, which means a moving herd of 500,000 animals. Against them, the Shah could count perhaps 400,000 soldiers, most of them tied up garrisoning cities he was afraid to leave ungarrisoned in case they revolted. That was the Shah's fatal decision, and it was made before the first Mongol crossed the border. His advisers urged him to concentrate everything and meet the invasion at the river line. He refused, distributed his armies among his walled cities, and prepared to absorb a raid. He was not being invaded by a raid. The Mongols came in 4 columns, which only an army with an unbreakable messenger system can attempt. One column went to Otrar and sat down in front of it to settle a specific debt. Another swung far north. A third went south. And the Khan himself, with the 4th, disappeared. He took his column northwest and then simply vanished into the Kyzylkum, the Red Desert, a waterless expanse that every local authority agreed was impassable for an army. He had Turkmen guides who knew the wells. He crossed it in the dead of winter, when there was snow to melt for water, and came out 400 miles behind the entire Khwarezmian defensive line at the gates of Bukhara from a direction in which no enemy could possibly exist. The garrison, understanding the situation with perfect clarity, tried to break out and was destroyed in the open. The city surrendered. He rode in through the gates, which he almost never did, and went to the great congregational mosque and asked whether it was the Shah's palace, and was told that it was the house of God. He dismounted. He climbed the steps of the pulpit and addressed the assembled notables of the city through interpreters, and told them, according to a Persian historian writing a generation later, that they should not trouble themselves about how this had happened, because they had committed great sins, and that he was the punishment of God, and that if they had not committed great sins, God would not have sent him among them. Every word of that speech is doubtful. What is not doubtful is that Bukhara, one of the great cities of Islamic learning, was emptied of its people, stripped by the soldiers, and then burned nearly to the ground when a fire got out of control during the fighting in the citadel. The population was marched out onto the plain and sorted, craftsmen kept, young men taken for the labor corps that would be driven at the walls of the next city, everyone else left to walk away from the smoke with nothing. A survivor of Bukhara made his way west and was asked what had happened there. He is supposed to have said that they came, they mined the walls, they burned, they killed, they plundered, and they departed. Samarkand was next, and Samarkand was the prize. It stood behind good walls with a garrison of tens of thousands, including war elephants. And the Shah had assured the city that it could hold out for years. It held for 5 days. The Mongols arrived from the west, from inside the empire, having eaten their way through the country behind the defenses, and they brought with them the columns from the north and the south, converging by the calendar on a place 1,000 miles from where they had started, which tells you everything about the messenger system. They also brought the prisoners taken from every town along the road, formed into a labor corps, and driven ahead to fill ditches and carry ladders, dressed to look like soldiers so that the defenders would overestimate the size of the army. A sortie from the city was drawn out and destroyed by feigned retreat, which was the oldest trick on the steppe and worked that year on some of the finest professional soldiers in the world. The elephants were released against the Mongol line, panicked, turned, and did their damage in the wrong direction. Then the city's Turkish garrison commanders, who were Turks in a Persian city and had no love for the Shah, negotiated their own surrender and came out. They were separated from the population and killed almost to a man, which was consistent. The law protected those who submitted before the fighting began. And these had submitted after, and had also betrayed their own employer, which was the crime he despised most in the world. The city itself was emptied, the craftsmen selected, and sent east 30,000 of them by one account, and the remaining people permitted to buy their lives with an enormous ransom. Samarkand was not leveled. It was hollowed out, which for a city of that kind amounts to a slower version of the same thing. Otrar, where the whole thing had begun, held out for 5 months, which was more courage than the governor deserved. When the walls were breached, he retreated to the citadel, and when the citadel fell, he fought on the roof. And when he had no weapons left, the story goes, his wife passed him bricks torn from the parapet to throw. He was taken alive. What was done to him afterwards involved molten silver and does not need describing at length, except to note that the punishment was chosen for its symbolism, which is a form of message sending as deliberate as anything else in this campaign. The Shah, meanwhile, ran. He had begun the war with the largest army between the Nile and the Indus, and he ended it as a fugitive with a small escort, moving west across Persia with 2 Mongol commanders behind him. He was never brought to battle. He died of pleurisy on a small island in the Caspian Sea in borrowed clothes with his son beside him, and was buried in a shirt that one of his companions took off his own back because there was nothing else. The 2 commanders who had chased him were Yebi and Subutai, and having lost their target, they sent a message home asking permission to keep going and have a look at what lay beyond. Permission was granted for 1 year. What followed is the most extraordinary cavalry expedition in history, and almost nobody outside the field has heard of it. They rode west into northern Persia and took towns as they went. They went up through Azerbaijan and into the kingdom of Georgia, which was at that moment preparing an army for a crusade to the Holy Land, and destroyed that army twice. And having no interest in occupying the country, rode on. They crossed the Caucasus Mountains in winter, over passes that shepherds avoided, dragging their siege engines and losing men to cold and to rockfalls, and came out on the northern side into the country of the Alans, who had allied with the Kipchak Turks to block them. Facing a combined force, they sent a private message to the Kipchaks, pointing out that the 2 of them were both peoples of the grass, and that the Alans were not, and offering them a part of the plunder to withdraw. The Kipchaks withdrew. The Alans were destroyed. Then the Mongols caught the Kipchaks separately, took the plunder back, and destroyed them too. The remnants fled to their in-laws, the Russian princes, and a coalition of Rus armies came out to meet the strangers at a river called the Kalka in the spring of 1223. The Mongols retreated for 9 days, drawing the coalition apart into a strung-out chase, then turned. The Rus lost catastrophically. Several princes were taken alive and, because it was not permitted to spill the blood of a ruler on the ground, were laid beneath the boards of a platform on which the Mongol officers then sat down to eat. And then, having beaten Georgians, Alans, Kipchaks, Bulgars, and Russians in a single circuit, The two commanders turned for home across the top of the Caspian, rejoining the main army after something over 3 years and 5,000 miles. They had not been conquering. They had been surveying. 20 years later, when a Mongol army came back into Russia and Hungary in earnest, one of those two men, Subutai, was the one planning the campaign, and he already knew every river crossing. Back in the south, the war went on, and it is here that the reputation was made. The eastern half of the Khwarezmian Empire, the province of Khorasan, was the richest agricultural region on the whole overland route between China and the Mediterranean, and it did not surrender quietly. Cities gave in, then rebelled when the main army moved on and the garrison was small. Mongol officers were killed, including one of the Khan's grandsons, a favorite, at the siege of Bamiyan. The response was systematic, and it was the response of someone who had decided that a province which could not be trusted at his back would cease to be a province. Merv, one of the largest cities on earth at that date, with libraries holding tens of thousands of volumes, surrendered on terms and was emptied anyway. The accounts of the numbers killed there are so large that no modern historian believes them, and so consistent that nobody can dismiss them either. Nishapur, where a son-in-law of the Khan had been killed by an arrow from the walls, was taken apart stone by stone and the ground sown with barley, and the task of it was given to the widow. Urgench, the old Khwarezmian capital, was fought street by street for months, and when it finally fell, the dikes of the Amu Darya were cut, and the site was flooded. The irrigation systems went with the cities. That is the part that mattered longest. Those cities lived on canal networks built and maintained over centuries. And a canal system needs constant work by a large population that knows what it is doing. Kill the population, and the canals silt up within a few seasons, and the fields go back to desert, and they stay desert. Parts of eastern Iran and Central Asia did not recover their 12th century population for 600 years. Some of it never came back at all. There is no way to make this proportionate, and it is not my job to try. The specific cause was the murder of a caravan and 3 ambassadors. The response was the erasure of a civilization's eastern half. Even by the standards of a century that was not squeamish, contemporaries in Baghdad and Damascus and Cairo wrote about it in a tone of stunned incomprehension. And one Arab historian said he wished he had died before he had to record it, and put off writing the chapter for years. One man fought back well and deserves his page. Jalal al-Din, the dead Shah's eldest son, who had urged his father to fight properly at the river and been ignored, gathered what forces he could in Afghanistan and beat a Mongol detachment in a mountain valley. The first clear defeat the Mongols had suffered in that war. His own army then broke up in an argument over the division of the spoils, which is the sort of detail that explains the whole difference between the two sides in one line. The Khan came after him personally, marched fast, and caught him against the gorge of the Indus. Jalal al-Din fought a rearguard through the morning, and when it was finished, he turned his horse, rode it off the cliff into the river, and swam to the far bank in his armor and came up on the sand on the other side. His pursuers were told not to shoot. The Khan is supposed to have watched him climb out and remarked to his own sons that this was what a son should be. He did not follow him into India. He sent a probing force towards the Punjab, considered the heat in the forests and the news of trouble at home, and turned back. The Mongols never seriously invaded India in his lifetime. and the reason appears to be nothing more complicated than that the climate did not suit horses, and he did not like the look of it. While all of this was going on, an old man in a felt tent in the mountains of Afghanistan was thinking about death. He was somewhere around 60. He had been thrown from horses more times than could be counted, had taken an arrow in the neck as a young man and another in the leg, and he was beginning to feel the accumulated cost of a life spent outdoors on a saddle. And he had begun to be interested in a practical and slightly wistful way in the question of whether anything could be done about it. So he sent for a holy man. He had heard through the network of merchants and captured scribes and defectors that fed him information about the settled world that there was a Taoist master in northern China named Chu Chuji, who was said to be 300 years old and to possess the medicine of immortality. He wrote to him. The letter that has come down to us is careful and courteous and does not sound remotely like a man who is used to being refused, which is precisely why it is interesting. He wanted something that could not be taken. The master was 71 and did not have the medicine of immortality, and he had already declined invitations from both the Jin and the Song emperors. He accepted this one. Then he walked and rode and was carried for more than 3 years across the Gobi, past the Altai, through the ruins of Samarkand, over the Hindu Kush, with 19 disciples and a Mongol escort to a camp in the mountains of the Hindu Kush. Their conversations were written down by one of the disciples, and they are the closest thing we have to hearing the man speak in a private setting about anything other than war. The Khan asked, first thing, what medicine of long life the master had brought him. The master answered that he had means of protecting life, but no medicine of immortality, which was an act of some courage in a tent belonging to a person who had recently converted several provinces into pasture. He was not punished. He was listened to and asked to come back repeatedly over the following months, and the Khan ordered that everything the master said be recorded. What the master actually taught was moderation, fewer women, less hunting, less drink, quiet of the mind. He explained the Taoist idea that the human spirit is a lamp that is burned down by appetite, and that the way to keep it is to spend less of it. He also, gently and persistently, argued that a ruler's chief virtue is restraint, that heaven values human life, and that a state is held together by not doing things rather than by doing them. The Khan gave him the title of spiritual master, exempted all Taoist clergy from taxes and forced labor, and sent him home under escort. He also, and this is the part that reads most like a human being, told his sons and his companions that he intended to hunt less, and then went hunting. But something in it stayed with him. In the last years, his letters and edicts are full of restraint as a theme, warnings against drunkenness, notably to his own heir, who badly needed them. Instructions that his commanders should not oppress the ordinary people of conquered lands, a long, rather melancholy statement that he had worn one color of clothing and eaten one kind of food, and that he had a duty to be as plain as a herdsman, because a man who takes everything and lives softly loses the only claim he has. Whether he actually was that plain is another question. The great camp that moved with him was a city of felt with thousands of carts. His chief wife had her own household, and so did each of the other senior wives, each of them a separate court with its own herds and servants and revenue, and he moved between them. He had a great many junior wives and concubines besides, most of them daughters of defeated houses, which was less about appetite than about diplomacy in a world with no other way to bind a family to yours. But the 4 sons who mattered were all Bortus, and Bortus' household came first in every ceremonial arrangement to the end of his life, and she had been the one whose advice broke the shaman. The return east took 2 years, because a Mongol army does not hurry and the grass has to grow back behind it. Somewhere in the mountains, on a good day, he reportedly saw a unicorn, or a deer-like creature that spoke, and was advised by his Chinese officials that it was a sign to turn back, and to have taken the advice, which suggests the officials had a firm grasp of what their employer would respond to. He came home to a country he had not seen in 7 years, and to a family problem he could not solve by any of the methods he was good at. Jochi, the eldest, had been given the western lands, the furthest from the center in the direction of the Kipchak steppe. Somewhere in the fighting around Urgench, he and his brother Chagatai had quarreled so badly over the division of the city that the campaign had stalled, and their father had put the youngest brother in charge over both of them. After the war, Jochi did not come back. He stayed out west with his herds, hunting, and when summoned to the great assembly, he sent excuses about his health. Word came, probably from Chagatai's people, that he was in fact perfectly well and hunting hard. His father ordered an army prepared to go and fetch him, which is a sentence with a great deal underneath it. Before it could march, riders came in with the news that Jochi had died, out on the western grass at about 40. The reaction, as recorded, was grief of a plain and complete kind. Whatever had been said in the tent that day about the Merkit bastard, and whatever the father had privately believed for 40 years, the man mourned his eldest son and then never spoke about the doubt at all. Jochi's own son, Bato, would take that western inheritance and ride it into Russia and Hungary within 20 years. And the line of Jochi would rule the northern steppe for 250. The other loss of those years was Macaulay, the commander left behind to run the Chinese war. A herdsman's son who had been given a golden seal and a free hand, and who had spent 9 years methodically taking apart the Jin Empire with a fraction of the men he needed. He died in camp partway through that job, still working, and reportedly regretting only that he had not finished it. His Khan felt the gap until his own last year, and said so. So, the empire, at this point. It is worth pausing here to see the shape of the thing, because in about a decade and a half a nation of herdsmen had produced a state that ran from the Sea of Japan to the Caspian, and the middle of it worked. The roads were safe. That is the fact contemporaries kept returning to with a kind of disbelief. It was said that a woman carrying a gold dish could ride from one end of the empire to the other without being troubled, which is obviously a slogan, and which nevertheless reflects something real. The caravan routes that had been chewed up by 1,000 little bandit lordships were now inside one legal system with one set of rules and a post system running down their length. Merchants came in numbers they had never come in before. Goods, seeds, techniques, medicines, musical instruments, map makers, doctors, and cooks moved along those roads in both directions. Chinese medical practice reached Persia, and Persian astronomy reached China. Printing, the blast furnace, the compass, and gunpowder moved west along that corridor within a century, and so. Eventually, and catastrophically, did a bacterium living in the fleas of steppe marmots, but that is another story, and it happened long after the man was dead. Religion was left alone, and not merely tolerated, but subsidized. Buddhist monks, Taoist priests, Muslim scholars, Nestorian Christian clergy, and shamans were all exempt from taxes and from service. And all of them appear in the imperial camp at once, arguing in front of a Khan who was personally a sky worshipper and who seems to have regarded the whole disagreement as an interesting technical dispute among specialists. His own daughters-in-law included a devout Christian and a Buddhist. There is no record anywhere of a person in his empire being punished for their beliefs, which in the 13th century puts him in a category of approximately 1. Women held real power, and the record on this is unusually clear. His mother had saved the family, his chief wife had shaped the crucial decisions, and his daughters were married to the rulers of allied peoples and then, in several cases, left to govern those peoples outright while their husbands were sent off to war and, in some cases, deliberately sent to the most dangerous part of it. A daughter ruling a kingdom on his flank was worth more than a garrison and cost nothing. Later, when the succession stalled, the empire was run for years at a time by widows acting as regents, and nobody appears to have thought it remarkable. And the army had become something new. It was no longer a horde in the sense that word acquired later. It was a standing force of professional units, drilled with signal flags by day and lanterns by night, organized in tens, capable of dispersing over 100 miles and arriving at one place on the same afternoon, supplied by its own herds with a permanent staff that gathered intelligence in advance, engineers who could take walls, a medical arrangement, and a rule that no commander was to fight a battle he had not scouted. Its officers were promoted for competence and executed for pride. It could travel further and faster on less than any army of its era by a factor that still looks like a mistake in the records. It had also by then killed a number of people that nobody can honestly compute. The figures given by contemporaries are impossible. The figures given by cautious moderns are still enormous. The plainest thing that can be said is that in the regions that resisted, a very large proportion of the population died, and that the man responsible did not regard it as a tragedy but as a policy that had worked. And that both of those statements need to be held in the mind at the same time if you want to understand anything at all about him. And what was he like, this person, sitting at the center of it? Start with the plainest problem. Nobody knows what he looked like. There is no portrait made from life, no coin with his profile, no description by anyone who met him and wrote it down at the time. What we have is second-hand and late and contradictory, and it is worth going through anyway, because the contradictions are themselves interesting. A Chinese envoy from the Song sent north to negotiate, and one of the very few outsiders who saw him in person described a man of great height and vigor with a broad forehead and a long beard. A Persian historian a generation later has him tall and strong with cat's eyes and hair going white in his last years. Another Persian source claims he had red hair and green or gray eyes, which sounds startling until you remember that light eyes and reddish hair are not rare among the peoples of the Altai and never have been, and that his own name for his clan, Borjikin, is glossed in some readings as gray-eyed. Later Chinese court painters gave him the calm, round face of a Confucian ancestor because that is what a founding emperor was supposed to look like. Later Persian miniatures gave him the features of a Persian nobleman. Everybody, in short, made him look like their own idea of authority, which is the fate of a man with no face. Of his habits there is rather more, because habits get repeated in a tent where 40 people are listening. He rose early and rode most days of his life. He hunted constantly, even when it was inadvisable, and it was a hunting accident that eventually killed him. He drank, and he knew he drank too much. And there is a recorded instruction on the subject that reads like a man arguing with himself. A man who is drunk is like a blind man who has lost his eyes and cannot stand up, and drink brings no skill and no virtue and no good repute. A ruler who is fond of drink cannot do great things. If there is no way to avoid drinking, then a man should get drunk 3 times a month, and twice would be better, and once better still, and not at all would be finest of all. But where is such a man to be found? His designated heir drank himself into the ground within 12 years, so the argument was not idle. He ate plainly, measured against any court on earth. One kind of food, one color of clothing, is how he put it, and while the great camp around him was enormously rich, he seems genuinely to have kept his own arrangements close to those of a well-off herdsman. He never learned to read. He never built himself a palace. When he took a city with a treasury in it, the contents were divided by the fixed rule, and his own share went mostly straight back out again as gifts. Because a Khan who accumulates and does not distribute is a Khan whose men start looking at his cousins. He had a memory for people that everyone remarked on. He knew his commanders of 1,000 by name and face, and their fathers, and what they had done. He asked questions of anybody with a skill: engineers, doctors, astronomers, merchants, monks. He listened to advice from women, from foreigners, from men who had been his enemies the year before, and from at least one prisoner of war who told him to his face that his family's destruction did not entitle him to expect gratitude. He did not listen to advice from anybody who was trying to flatter him, and he had a well-attested habit of asking the same question of several people separately and comparing the answers. He was superstitious after the fashion of his country and time. He prayed to the eternal blue sky on mountain tops, with his belt round his neck and his hat in his hand, kept shamans, believed in omens and dreams, and consulted the cracks in a burnt sheep's shoulder blade before a campaign. He also, quite comfortably, employed Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Taoists at once and asked them all what they thought, on the assumption that heaven presumably had several offices. And he was, by every indication in the sources, a person of formidable self-control and almost no capacity for forgiveness. He waited 15 years to settle the business with the clan that abandoned his mother. He waited 20 years to answer an insult from the Tangut court, and answered it in his 60s, dying rather than let it go. When something was decided, it did not get undecided. He forgave one category of person only, and that was the enemy who had fought him honestly and lost. And he promoted a remarkable number of them. Then there were his children, and here the great organizer of other people's loyalties was, like most parents, largely a passenger. Jochi, the eldest, the boy whose parentage could not be discussed, was a serious and capable commander with a reputation for taking cities intact rather than leveling them, which caused friction with his brothers. And he ended his life estranged and out on the western grass, dead before 40. Chagatai II was the family's stickler, rigid, unforgiving, deeply attached to the letter of his father's law, and the one who said the unsayable thing in the assembly tent. He was given the middle of the empire and enforced the code there with a severity that made even Mongols nervous. Ogedei III was the pleasant one. Generous to a fault, physically brave, wholly without malice, and an alcoholic. His father chose him precisely because his brothers could bear him, and the choice held the empire together for a decade and then let it slip. To Louis, the youngest, kept the hearth and the homeland and most of the army by steppe custom, was the most gifted soldier of the four and the most alarming. Ran the campaign in Khorasan and died young also of drink, having reportedly taken on himself a shaman's ritual to save his sick brother's life, which is either a beautiful story or an excellent cover for a death that suited somebody. And there were daughters, whom the popular story leaves out entirely. He married them to the rulers of the peoples along his flanks, and then, in more than one case, arranged matters so that the husband was away on campaign more or less permanently, while the daughter governed the kingdom. One of them ruled the Uya country. One ruled the Ongut, who guarded the road south. They collected the taxes, sat in judgment, and provisioned armies. He called them his 9 bright jewels, or so the story goes. And the practical fact is that his flanks were held by his own children while his sons were out at the far end of a continent, which is a piece of political engineering as neat as anything in the military record. He was, in the end, a man who spent his entire adult life solving one problem: how to make a large number of people who have no reason to trust each other behave as though they do. He solved it in the only 2 ways he knew, which were exact, generous, publicly kept promises to everyone inside the arrangement, and an absolutely reliable, thoroughly advertised catastrophe for everyone who refused to join it. That is not a moral. It is just what the evidence shows, and now the evidence is nearly finished, because we have come to the last winter. There was one piece of unfinished business, and it was the oldest one. Back at the beginning of the Western War, when the army was mustering for Khwarezm, the Khan had sent to his vassal, the Tangut king of Shisia, and asked for troops, as a vassal is required to provide. The reply, delivered by one of the king's ministers and apparently rather enjoyed at court, was that if the Khan lacked the strength to fight his own wars, he had no business calling himself a Khan. He had been about to march 4,000 miles in the other direction. He noted it, said aloud that he would deal with it when he came back, and went. He came back. In the winter of 1226, at about 64, he crossed the desert into Shishia with his army for the last time. The campaign was short and pitiless, and there is not much to say about it that has not already been said about the others, except for the detail that he was ill through most of it. On the march in, during a winter hunt, his horse shied at a herd of wild asses and threw him. He was an old man by then, and he came down hard, and that night he had a high fever. His officers advised abandoning the campaign and going home to recover, and pointed out that the Tanguts had walled cities and were not going anywhere. He asked what the enemy would say if the army turned round, answered his own question, and stayed in the field. He did not recover. Over the following months the illness came and went and came back. And there is a good deal of guesswork about what it was: typhus, plague, the after effects of internal injuries from the fall, or simply an exhausted body. He kept command. The Tangut cities fell one after another. The capital was invested and held out for 6 months while its king negotiated. In August of 1227, in a camp in the Lupin Mountains in the summer heat. With the Tangut capital about to surrender, he died. He was somewhere between 60 and 65. Nobody knows the exact date, and nobody knows the exact cause, and by the standards of this story, that is entirely appropriate. Before he died, he gave 2 sets of instructions, and both were carried out to the letter. The first was strategic, and it was startling. He told his sons and generals how to finish the jinn. The jinn, he said, had one impassable position, the fortified river pass at Tongguan, with mountains on one side and the Yellow River on the other, and it could not be taken from the north. So they should not go from the north. They should ask passage from the Song, the Chinese empire in the south, who hated the jinn and would grant it, and come up behind. He was correct. His son did exactly that 7 years later, and the Jin Empire ended. The second instruction was that his death was to be concealed until the Tongan capital had surrendered, so that the garrison would not take heart. That was done too. The city opened its gates on terms, and its people were dealt with in a way that the surviving records describe only in outline, and that nobody who has read this far will need explained. Then the funeral party started north. Everything about that journey is legend, which is exactly what he would have wanted, and it is worth taking the legend seriously as evidence of something, even when they cannot be evidence of fact. The body was carried home in a covered cart, and the escort reportedly killed everyone they encountered on the road so that no one could carry word ahead. The burial itself was made somewhere on or near the mountain called Brakan Khaldun, the sacred peak of the northern forests, the mountain where a hunted boy had once hidden for 9 days and come down alive and given thanks to it. He had picked out the spot years before, according to the story, while resting under a lone tree, and to have told his companions that he liked it there. No monument was raised. That was the custom, and in his case it was policy. Steppe rulers were buried without markers so that the grave could not be found and desecrated by enemies, and the burial party is described as leveling the ground with 1,000 horses driven over it, and then to have planted trees, or waited for the grass, and, in the most repeated version of the story, to have been killed themselves by a second detachment, which was then killed in turn, so that the location died with them. For centuries, a guard of a particular clan watched a forbidden zone of about 10,000 square miles in the northern mountains and let nobody in. The site has never been found. Modern expeditions with satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have gone looking, and Mongolian opinion has been strongly and reasonably against them, on the grounds that the man went to considerable trouble not to be dug up. So the largest land empire ever assembled by one person began with a boy digging roots on a riverbank and ends with an unmarked patch of grass on a mountain, and between the two there is no tomb, no portrait made from life, no statue he sat for, no letter in his own hand, and not one description of his face that anyone can trust. There is a famous painted portrait of an old man in a white robe with a wispy beard, and it was made half a century after he died, by an artist who never saw him, for a court that wanted a Chinese-looking ancestor. That is the best we have. He remains, in the most literal sense, a man with no face and no grave, who rearranged the population of the planet. The empire did not fall apart at once, which was the whole point of the preceding 20 years of institution building, and which had never happened before on that grass. Ogedei, the third son, the amiable drinker, was confirmed as Khan 2 years later at an assembly on the Karulin, after his youngest brother had held the regency without making any move to take the title. Ogedei proved a genuinely capable ruler in the one way that mattered. He did not interfere with people who knew what they were doing. He kept Yelu Chukai and let him build a tax system with registers and collectors and fixed rates, so that the empire started living on revenue rather than on plunder. He built a capital city at Karakoram, which was not much of a city by Chinese standards, a walled town of perhaps 10,000 people with a Buddhist temple, 2 mosques, a Christian church, and a famous silver drinking fountain shaped like a tree with 4 pipes running 4 different drinks, built by a captured goldsmith from Paris who had been picked up in Hungary. That fountain is a better summary of the Mongol Empire than any battle. He finished the Jin exactly as instructed. He sent Subutai and his nephew Batu west into Russia, and they took every Russian principality in a single winter campaign, moving on frozen rivers because a frozen river is a road, and then went on into Poland and Hungary and beat 2 European armies in 2 days at opposite ends of the Carpathians, 400 miles apart. In a coordinated operation planned by a commander in his 60s who had first crossed those rivers with Hebe 20 years earlier. And then, in the winter of 1241, the Mongol armies in Europe turned around and rode east. And the reason was that Ogidi had drunk himself to death, and every prince of the blood was required to come home for the assembly. Europe was saved by an alcoholic in Mongolia, which is either an accident or the clearest possible demonstration of the flaw the whole system carried inside it from the first day. Everything, in the end, hung on one family agreeing about one chair. They did not agree for long. The empire held together in name for a generation more. Ogidi's widow ran it as regent for 5 years. Then the line shifted, and the 4 sons of Tului, born to that serious Carrot Christian princess, Sorkaktani, took the whole thing over. She deserves her paragraph, because she may be the most quietly effective person in this entire story. Widowed young, she refused a remarriage proposed by the Khan himself, kept her son's inheritance intact, ran the family's estates in northern China with a light hand that kept the farmers alive and productive, hired scholars from every religion to teach her boys, made sure each learned a different useful language, and then maneuvered her eldest onto the throne by careful alliance building over a decade. Her 4 sons were the great Khan who reorganized the empire. The Khan who conquered Baghdad and Persia, the Khan who conquered China and founded a dynasty there, and the one who lost the Civil War. She was a Christian who endowed Muslim schools. When she died, the empire she had made possible ran from Korea to Syria. And that empire, once her sons had it, promptly split, because it was too large for one messenger system and because the family had run out of the one thing their grandfather had built the whole apparatus to enforce, which was the habit of doing what they were told. It became 4 empires: China and the East, Persia and the Middle East, the Central Asian Middle, and the Northern Grass and Russia. They fought each other. The Persian branch and the Russian branch went to war within 1 generation, and each converted to a different religion. And the descendants of the men who drank the muddy water at Baljuna spent the next century as rival Muslim, Buddhist, and Christian dynasties who could no longer read one another's letters. Before we leave the family and go looking for what any of it meant, there is a small ledger to close, and it is the most satisfying part of the whole account, because he closed it himself in public and made a point of it. At the great assembly after the wars on the grass were over, he sat down and went through, one by one, the people who had been decent to him when he was nobody, and paid them all. The herdsman's son, who had ridden off after stolen horses with a stranger and refused to be paid for it, received the command of the entire right wing of the army, 10,000 men, and the first place among the companions and lands, and a standing invitation that his family and their descendants for 9 generations be pardoned any offense. The family of the man who had let a boy lie in the shallows of a river and said nothing, and then hidden him under a cartload of wool while searchers poked at it, were brought to the assembly. The father was given a district of his own, the right to keep whatever he took on campaign, and the same 9-generation pardon. His son, who had cut the wooden collar off and burned it, was made a commander. They were also, and this is the detail that gives it away as sincere rather than theatrical, given the freedom to enter the Khan's tent at any hour without being announced, which was a thing almost nobody had. The herdsman who had overheard a murder plot at his fire and sent a warning rather than keeping quiet was given a command, and a share of the herds, and the right to carry a quiver in the presence of the Khan, which sounds small and was not. The father of the companion who had spent a night sucking the clotted blood out of a boy's neck wound and then crept into an enemy camp for a bucket of curds was honored. The man himself was given the pardon of 9 offenses and a place among the 4 closest. Meanwhile, the men who had betrayed their own masters at any point, in any circumstance, for any reason, and had come to him expecting a reward for it, were killed every single time. The son of a chief who murdered his own father and brought the body in was executed. The men who tied up a sworn brother and delivered him were executed. A servant who pointed out where his fleeing lord was hiding was executed after the lord had been dealt with, on the reasoning that a man who does that once is a man who will do it again, and that whoever employs him is next in line. There is nothing sentimental in this. It is a system of incentives published to the largest possible audience, and it worked exactly as designed. For 2 generations, senior officers of the Mongol Empire almost never changed sides, and enemy officers who wanted to change sides knew they had to do it before the fighting, in the open, and never by handing over a body. As for the 4 dogs and the 4 steeds, as the poets called his great commanders, they mostly died in harness. Jebe, the enemy archer who had shot the Khan's horse from under him and then admitted it to his face, died somewhere on the long ride home from Russia, worn out at the end of 5,000 miles. Subutai, the blacksmith's son, outlived his Khan by a quarter of a century and went on to plan the campaigns that took Russia and beat 2 European armies in a single week, and finished his life back home on the Toul River as an old man among his herds, having fought, by 1 count, in more than 60 engagements and lost none of them. Mukali died in camp in China, still working. Buishu grew old and rich and honored. Belgutai, the half-brother, lived a very long time, was given a great household, and by one account died past 90 in the reign of the grandsons, having outlasted everybody in this story, including the empire's second Khan. Holan, who had held 7 children together on roots and fish and refused to let the world close over them, lived to see her son proclaimed Khan of everything under the sky. What she made of it is not recorded, and the last picture we have of her is that white camel cart arriving at dawn to untie a son from his ropes. And Borte, promised at 10 years old in a betrothal arranged between 2 men over a bowl of milk, carried off by raiders and got back at enormous cost, mother of the 4 sons who divided a continent between them, outlived the doubt, outlived the shaman she had warned about, and ran the first household of the empire until the end. She is not recorded as having a title of state. She did not need one. Which brings us, one last time, back to the shallow lake. 19 men and 1 man in the middle of them, on a hot afternoon, at the bottom of everything, drinking water that horses had been standing in. Not one of them, at that moment, had any rational grounds for expecting to be alive the following spring. They were not a nation, and they were not an army. They were the residue of a defeat, and what they had instead of prospects was an agreement. Every last one of them who lived through the next 10 years was given a command, a district, an income, and a name that his descendants used as a title. The oath at that lake became a currency. And the reason it worked, the reason the whole improbable structure held together from the Yellow Sea to the Danube for as long as it did, is that the man in the middle of them kept his half of it, publicly and repeatedly, in a world where almost nobody kept anything. He had been abandoned once, as a child, on the grass, by everybody who owed him something. He appears to have spent the following 50 years constructing, at enormous cost to the rest of humanity, a machine in which that could never happen again to anyone who was on his side. There is a question that ought to be asked at this point, and it is one of the quiet pleasures of this whole subject. How do we know any of it? There were no Mongol historians in his lifetime. There was barely any Mongol writing at all until the last 20 years of it. And yet we have an account of his childhood so specific that it includes a stolen fish, a wooden collar, a quarrel about a lark, and the exact insult a mother used to shame her sons. The answer is a single strange book, and its survival is nearly as unlikely as the life it describes. Not long after his death, someone in the imperial family caused an account of his ancestry and his life to be written down in Mongolian, in the vertical script borrowed from the Yigirs, apparently at an assembly by the Caroline River. It was a private document intended for the royal house and not for outsiders, and it is now called The Secret History of the Mongols. It is written in a strange, beautiful, half-poetic style, full of proverbs and animal similes and long alliterative speeches, and it is astonishingly frank. It records the killing of the half-brother. It records the abandonment by the clan. It records the theft of a wife and the doubt about a son, and the fistfight in the assembly tent. It calls the Khan afraid in as many words on at least 2 occasions. Nobody writing propaganda writes like that. Then the empire fell, and the Mongolian original was lost, and the book vanished for centuries. What saved it was a Chinese language school. Ming Dynasty officials, needing to teach Mongolian to interpreters, took the text and wrote it out phonetically in Chinese characters, character by character, with a rough translation beside it, purely as a language exercise. Nobody cared what it said. It sat in Chinese archives in a form no Mongol could read and no Chinese reader could understand for 400 years, until 19th and 20th century scholars worked out what they were looking at and, syllable by syllable, reversed the process and got the Mongolian back. So the earliest and most intimate biography of the man who conquered half the world survived because a bureaucrat needed a textbook, and because nobody thought it was important. Alongside it, we have the Persian historians, several of whom wrote in the service of the Mongol rulers of Persia and had access to imperial archives now lost. The Chinese dynastic records, the accounts of Muslim writers whose cities were destroyed, which are furious and invaluable, and later the reports of European friars sent to the Mongol court, who wrote down what people ate and how the tents were arranged in the manner of men who assumed nobody would believe them. Out of all that, held against each other, comes a life that is better documented than most medieval kings of Europe and still at the center, unknowable, now the legacy, which is a genuinely difficult accounting problem. Begin with the destruction, because it should always be first. Whole cities were emptied. Whole irrigation civilizations were ended. The population of Persia and Central Asia fell by a fraction that historians argue about, but which nobody puts at less than a quarter. And in some provinces, the fields never came back at all. Libraries went, and with them books that existed nowhere else, and we have no idea what was in them, which is the particular grief of that kind of loss. Northern China lost a staggering proportion of its registered population in the wars against the Jin, some of it dead and some of it fled or simply uncounted in the collapse of the record-keeping. A conservative modern figure for the deaths caused by his campaigns and those of his immediate successors is many millions in a world of perhaps 400 million people. As a share of the living population, the wars of the 13th century have no modern equal, which is a sentence I would rather not have to write about a man whose administrative reforms I admire. Now the other column, and the honest thing, is to keep both open. The roads. For roughly 100 years, the whole overland belt from Korea to the Black Sea sat inside one legal umbrella with one relay system, and merchants moved along it under protection. That corridor carried more than silk. It carried Chinese medicine and Persian astronomy, Arabic mathematics and Chinese printing techniques, crop varieties, cannon, playing cards, distilling, cartography, and enough factual knowledge of the far side of Asia to make European mapmakers redraw their world. A merchant's son from Venice went out along that road as a boy and came home decades later with a description of China so detailed that his own countrymen assumed he was lying, and one copy of that description was later read to pieces by a Genoese sailor who used it to argue that if you sailed west far enough, you would reach the same place. That is a long causal chain, and it should not be pushed too hard, but the road existed because of the man in the felt tent, and the world knew itself better afterwards. The idea of a state without a state religion. It is worth saying plainly, in the 13th century, in a world of crusades and inquisitions and forced conversions, this empire taxed all faiths equally, meaning not at all, and let its subjects argue theology in front of the throne as entertainment. It was not tolerance out of tenderness. It was tolerance out of indifference and administrative sense. It worked anyway, and the states that inherited the Mongol arrangement in Persia, India and Russia carried pieces of it forward for centuries. The idea that ability outranks birth. His generals were sons of carpenters and shepherds and enemies. In a world organized entirely around inheritance, that was close to a heresy, and it is the single clearest reason a nation of 1 million people defeated empires of 50 million. The paper trail, census, written law, registered taxation at fixed rates, passports, a postal service, diplomatic immunity as an absolute principle, and the deliberate protection of merchants, doctors, teachers, and clergy. Some of that existed elsewhere in pieces. Nowhere else was it all assembled at once by a people who had been living entirely on milk and horses 2 decades earlier. And the plague, which belongs in the first column and is nobody's intention. The same protected roads that carried printing west almost certainly carried the bacterium that lives in the fleas of steppe rodents out of its home range and into the trade cities, and from there by ship to everywhere. The Black Death killed a larger share of Europe than the Mongols killed of Persia. It is the darkest possible illustration of the point that connection is not the same thing as benefit. Then there is the strangest legacy of all, and it is genetic. A large study of Y chromosomes across Asia found an unusually common lineage shared by a substantial fraction of men in a broad band across the old empire, a pattern that looks as if it spread very fast from a small origin, at about the right time and across exactly the right geography. It cannot be pinned to one individual with certainty, and the popular versions of the claim are far too confident. But something spread, and it spread with power, and it spread from the family that held that power for generations, and the arithmetic of a household in which every son and grandson had many wives and hundreds of descendants does the rest. And what of the man's own country? For most of the 20th century, Mongolia was a satellite of the Soviet Union, and the memory of the founder was suppressed with some determination. He was written out of the school books as a feudal reactionary. Scholars who took an interest in him were persecuted, some fatally. The 800th anniversary of the Great Assembly was marked in 1962 with a commemorative stamp and a conference. And the official who permitted it lost his position for nationalism, and the stamp was withdrawn. Then the system changed, and the country got itself back, and he came out of the cupboard all at once. He is on the banknotes now. The airport is named for him. There is a vodka, a hotel, and a beer. On the step east of the Capitol there stands a statue of a man on a horse, plated in stainless steel, 130 feet high, visible from a very long way across the grass, with a viewing platform in the horse's head. Whatever one thinks of it, and opinions vary, it makes a plain point. In the country he made, he is not a historical problem. He is the reason there is a country. Elsewhere the memory is very different, and it should be. In Iran, in Iraq, in Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan, the name means the year the canals died. Both memories are correct. They are simply about different ends of the same man. So what do we do with him? The temptation is to reach for a verdict, and the verdict is always unsatisfying, because the two halves of the account do not cancel each other out. They simply both happened, and they happened for the same reasons and out of the same qualities. The patience that let a poor young man spend 15 years assembling an alliance, one family at a time, is the same patience that sat down in front of a walled city for 6 months. The refusal to forget an injury that made him keep faith with a herdsman who once hid him under a load of wool is the same refusal that turned a murdered caravan into the end of a civilization. The talent for organization that produced the post roads and the written law and the tax registers is the talent that made the destruction so much more thorough than any ordinary warlord could have managed. There is no version of him in which you keep the roads and lose the ruins. It is one man. What can be said, and is worth saying at the end of a long night, is that almost nothing about the outcome was likely. Consider what had to happen. A minor chief on the poorest edge of the poorest grassland in Asia had to be poisoned by his enemies at exactly the moment his eldest son was old enough to remember it and too young to inherit. That son had to be abandoned and survive, which children in that position generally did not. He had to meet, by chance, at a hollow in the grass, a young man who would give away his own horse for a stranger. He had to lose a wife and get her back, and choose, for whatever reason, to bury the question of his eldest son rather than let it eat him. He had to lose a battle so badly that he ended up drinking silty water with 19 men, and to have built, by then, the kind of reputation that made 19 people stay. And then, having survived all of that, he had to be the one-step conqueror in 1,000 years who understood that the winning was the easy part. That is the piece that still seems to me the genuinely rare thing in this life, and it has nothing to do with battles. Everybody on that grass could fight. Several of his contemporaries could fight as well as he could, and one or two probably better. What none of them did was to look at a society organized around family loyalty and blood feud and decide that the family had to go, to break up the tribes, to promote the shepherd over the prince, to make the law apply to his own relatives, to write it down in a script he could not read, to protect merchants he had no use for and clergy whose gods he did not share, and to build a post road so that a man 3 months away could still be given an order. He had no model for any of that. There was nothing on the step to copy. He worked it out from the inside of his own experience, which had taught him, early and permanently, that the only durable thing a person can own is other people's willingness to stay. He also, to say the last honest thing, built it on a scale of suffering that no ledger balances. Both things. Keep them both. Now let the whole of it go quiet for a moment. The country he came from is still there, and it is still mostly empty. If you stood tonight on the grass above the Onan River, where a woman once dug lily bulbs with a stick of juniper to feed 7 children, you would see almost exactly what he saw. The grass going silver where the wind crosses it. The low brown hills, the larch forest coming down off the northern slopes, and above that the bare shoulder of a mountain that people still climb slowly on foot, adding a stone to the cairn at the top and walking round it 3 times in the sunshine. Somewhere under that country, in a place that nobody has found and that a good many people hope nobody ever will, there is an unmarked patch of ground with a man in it. And out on the flats there are still white tents with the doors facing south, and the smoke going up through the wheel at the top, and horses standing head to tail in the shade, and a bowl of soured milk on a low table for whoever happens to walk in, because a stranger who comes to a fire in that country is still fed without being asked who he is. Empires do not really end. They get quieter. They come apart into the ordinary things that outlast them. A road that people still use because it was always the sensible place for a road. A word borrowed into another language. A rule about not fouling the water. A habit of feeding a traveler. 800 years is a long time, and it is not very long at all. The grass has grown over the whole story, and the grass is what the story was always about. Let that be the last picture. Miles of green country under an enormous sky, going on further than anybody can ride, and the wind moving across it, and nothing at all needing to be decided tonight. Are you still awake? If you are, that is quite all right. There is another long story waiting for you on the screen, and it will start whenever you want it to, and you can drift in and out of it as you please. If this one helped, a like tells the quiet machinery of this place to send it to somebody else who is lying awake right now. And a subscription means the next one finds you without your having to go looking. And do leave your town and your local time in the comments if you feel like it. There is a whole soft roll call of us down there in every time zone. And it is a good thing to read when the night feels long. Let your shoulders drop, let your jaw unclench, let the pillow take the whole weight of your head, all of it, none of it held. Breathe out slowly, and slower still, and slower again. Close your eyes. Good night, and sweet dreams.